What if some people walking among us aren't entirely human? For decades, alleged abductees have described a terrifying human-alien hybrid program, claiming that extraterrestrial beings are combining human and alien DNA to create a new generation of hybrids. Some theories suggest these beings could be designed to look increasingly human, making them impossible to recognize. But are these stories evidence of a secret extraterrestrial experiment, or just one of the most controversial theories in UFO lore? And if human-alien hybrids really existed, how would we know they were already among us? In this video, we investigate the human-alien hybrid mystery and the claims surrounding one of the strangest stories in UFO history. Somewhere on this planet, right now, someone is living a double life they did not choose and cannot fully explain. They walk among us, hold jobs, raise children, pay bills, and yet carry inside them a question so strange that most of them never say it out loud. What if I am not entirely human? This is not the premise of a science fiction film. It is a claim made, in one form or another, by thousands of people across dozens of countries, spanning more than 70 years of recorded testimony. Researchers call them hybrids. The people themselves often use quieter words: different, marked, chosen, or simply aware. Whatever the label, the phenomenon they describe is remarkably consistent, and that consistency is the first thread we are going to pull on. The idea of human-alien hybrids did not begin with a Hollywood script or an internet forum. It began, according to the earliest documented cases, in ordinary bedrooms on ordinary highways in the years right after the Second World War, when the modern era of UFO sightings itself was born. In 1961, Betty and Barney Hill, a couple driving home through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, reported missing several hours of time and later recalled, under hypnosis, an encounter aboard a craft where physical samples were taken from their bodies. Their case became the template against which nearly every abduction account since has been measured. It introduced the world to a now familiar structure: missing time, medical procedures, and a lingering, unexplained sense that something had been done to them for a purpose they were never allowed to understand. What made the Hill case different from a simple ghost story or a tall tale told around a campfire was the level of physiological and psychological detail. Betty Hill described needles inserted near the navel in a way that, at the time, closely resembled a diagnostic procedure not yet publicly known to medicine: amniocentesis, a technique for testing fetal genetic material, which had not yet been widely reported in the press. Skeptics point out that fertility research was advancing quickly in that era, and such knowledge could plausibly have reached the public through channels now lost to history. Believers argue the timing is exactly the kind of detail that should not have been available to a rural New England couple with no background in medicine. That tension, a strange coincidence that could be explained away, but only just, is a pattern we will see again and again throughout this investigation. If the Hill case opened the door, the decades since have flooded through it. By the late 1980s, researchers working independently of one another, a psychiatrist at Temple University named David Jacobs, and a Harvard-affiliated professor of psychiatry named John Mack, had each accumulated hundreds of case files describing a phenomenon far more elaborate than a single medical exam aboard a spacecraft. Their subjects, under hypnosis and sometimes in ordinary waking recall, described a program, not a single encounter but a recurring one, often beginning in early childhood and continuing across a lifetime. They described repeated visits by the same beings, the same environments, and most disturbingly, the repeated harvesting of reproductive material. Eggs from women, sperm from men, followed years later by being shown infants. Infants, these adults were told, in ways they could not always articulate, were somehow theirs. John Mack's involvement gave the subject a credibility it had never had before. This was not a fringe writer chasing tabloid headlines. Mack was the head of the psychiatry department at a Harvard-affiliated hospital, a Pulitzer Prize winner for a biography of T.E. Lawrence, a man with no financial or professional incentive to lend his name to a subject that could, and nearly did, end his career. When Harvard opened a confidential internal review of his work in 1994, the first of its kind aimed at a tenured faculty member for the content of his research rather than its methodology, it sent a message across the academic world. This is a subject serious people are not supposed to touch. Mack was ultimately cleared, with the university affirming his academic freedom, but the episode left a permanent mark on how hybrid research would be treated in institutional science for the next 30 years. It became something researchers pursued quietly, if at all, and something practitioners in clinical psychology learned to document carefully but discuss selectively. What Mack found, across more than 200 subjects who had no contact with one another, was a level of narrative overlap he described as difficult to dismiss as coincidence or cultural contamination. People from different states, different countries, different educational backgrounds, and religious upbringings described nursery-like rooms filled with rows of translucent containers. They described being led, sometimes physically, sometimes through what they perceived as an overwhelming compulsion they could not resist, to hold an infant that felt at once familiar and deeply foreign. Many described the infants as pale, with large heads and eyes disproportionate to their bodies, thin limbs, and a stillness that read as neither fully human nor fully alien, and overwhelmingly, subjects reported an emotional response that surprised even them. Not fear, not confusion, but something closer to grief or love, or a bond they could not rationally justify for a being they were meeting for what felt like the first time. This is the detail that separates hybrid testimony from almost every other category of paranormal claim. Ghost stories evoke fear, cryptid sightings evoke wonder or dread, but hybrid accounts, told by people with no prior connection to one another, consistently evoke something closer to parental attachment, an emotion notoriously difficult to fake and notoriously specific to the biological experience of having or almost having a child. Whatever is happening in these accounts, whether physical event, elaborate deception, or a psychological phenomenon we don't yet understand, the emotional signature is not random. It points towards something with the shape of reproduction, of lineage, of continuity between two populations that are not supposed to have any biological relationship at all. Which raises the obvious question, the one this entire investigation is built around. Why would an advanced, presumably technologically superior species need human genetic material at all? If a civilization can cross interstellar distances, why would it require the reproductive tissue of a species it has, by definition, already surpassed? The answers proposed by researchers in the field cluster into three broad categories, and it's worth naming them clearly before we go further, because each will demand its own evidence later in this account. The first is genetic decline, the theory that an alien lineage, having existed for a vastly longer time than humanity, may be facing genetic exhaustion, a kind of biological entropy that no longer responds to their own reproductive methods, and that human DNA offers something their own genome has lost: adaptability, resilience, hybrid vigor in the most literal sense. The second is adaptation, the idea that a species built for another environment, another gravity, another atmosphere, may be using hybridization as a slow generational process of acclimating to conditions on Earth, effectively building a population that could survive here long-term without needing biosuits or artificial environments. The third, and by far the most unsettling to sit with, is integration. The theory that the hybrid program is not about the aliens adapting to us at all, but about preparing something or someone to move among us undetected, embedded in ordinary human society for a purpose that has not yet been revealed to the people who claim to be part of it. None of these explanations require aliens to be either benevolent or malevolent in any simple sense. A species solving a genetic crisis is not necessarily a villain. A parent species trying to survive on a planet is not necessarily malicious. But the methodology described by contactees, repeated, non-consensual, often beginning in childhood and continuing without the subject's ability to say no, sits deeply uncomfortably with any narrative of benevolence, however the end goal is framed. This is one of the central tensions in the entire hybrid literature, and it is a tension the people at the center of it, the self-described contactees and experiencers, live with every day. Many describe a relationship with these experiences that is neither fully victimhood nor fully partnership, but something stranger, an ongoing, unresolved relationship with a process they did not start and cannot end, involving beings they sometimes fear and sometimes, against all apparent logic, feel love for. It's worth pausing here to address the obvious skeptical position because a serious investigation owes it that much. The dominant psychological explanation for abduction and hybrid narratives is sleep paralysis compounded by cultural priming, a well-documented neurological state in which a person wakes from REM sleep while the body's natural paralysis mechanism hasn't yet switched off, producing vivid, often terrifying hallucinations of a presence in the room. Combine that with decades of cultural exposure to alien imagery through film, television, and folklore, and you have, skeptics argue, a ready-made template the sleeping brain reaches for when it needs to explain an inexplicable, terrifying, but ultimately internal experience. This explanation accounts for a great many cases. It likely accounts for most single encounter reports involving a bedroom, a paralyzed body, and a shadowy figure at the foot of the bed. Where it struggles is with the cases that don't fit that shape at all. Daytime encounters with multiple witnesses, corroborated missing time verified by independent third parties, such as employers or family members unaware of each other's accounts, and physical evidence including unexplained scarring, biological markers, and in a smaller number of cases, radiation signatures measured by professionals with no stake in the outcome. Sleep paralysis is a real and well-understood phenomenon. It is also not a complete explanation for every case in the hybrid literature, and honest skeptics within the scientific community, including some who spent careers debunking UFO claims, have acknowledged as much. The mystery does not collapse entirely under scrutiny. It narrows, and what remains after that narrowing is the actual subject of this investigation. Over the parts that follow, we are going to walk through this phenomenon methodically, the way a case file should be built. We'll examine the earliest documented hybrid cases in detail, including the physical evidence collected by investigators at the time. We'll look closely at the testimony of contactees who claim ongoing, decades-long relationships with hybrid offspring, and at the researchers, some credentialed, some self-taught, who spent their careers trying to catalog and verify these claims. We'll look at whistleblower testimony from people who claim direct involvement in government programs studying this material, and we'll weigh that testimony against what is verifiably known about classified research programs from the same era. We'll examine the physical descriptions of hybrids across cases separated by geography and decades, and ask whether that consistency is evidence of something real or evidence of a shared cultural mythology so deeply embedded that it now writes itself into people's memories without their awareness. And we'll look carefully at the most difficult question of all. If even a fraction of this testimony is accurate, what does it mean for a species to discover it is no longer, in the strictest biological sense, alone in its own bloodline? This is not a story with a tidy resolution. No government has confirmed it. No peer-reviewed journal has settled it. What exists instead is a body of testimony collected over 7 decades, from thousands of people with no apparent motive to lie, describing an experience so specific, so emotionally consistent, and so biologically detailed that it has resisted every attempt to fully explain it away. That resistance is not proof. But in an investigation like this one, it is the reason to keep looking. And so we begin, as any real investigation must, at the beginning, with the case that started it all, and the couple who, more than 60 years ago, sat down with a hypnotherapist and described, for the first time on record, what it felt like to have something taken from them that they were never meant to remember. Betty and Barney Hill were, by every account of the people who knew them, unremarkable in the best sense of the word. Barney worked for the Postal Service in Boston and served on the local NACP board. Betty worked in social services. They were a mixed-race couple in early 1960s New England, at a time when that alone required a certain quiet courage, and by all accounts they were not the type of people inclined toward exaggeration or public spectacle. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because it became one of the earliest arguments researchers used against the idea that the Hills had fabricated their story for attention. Attention, in their social position and their era, was not something they were seeking. If anything, going public with a story about alien abduction carried professional and personal risk that a fame-seeking couple would have thought twice about. On the night of September 19, 1961, the Hills were driving home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, after a vacation in Canada, taking a route through the White Mountains that ran late into the night. Betty first noticed a light in the sky that seemed to be following their car, moving in a manner inconsistent with any aircraft she recognized. Barney stopped the car and got out with a pair of binoculars to look more closely, and what he later described seeing, under hypnosis years afterward, was a disc-shaped craft with figures visible through what appeared to be windows, figures that seemed to be watching him in return. What happened next is the part of the story neither of them could account for on their own. They arrived home roughly 2 hours later than the drive should have taken, with no clear memory of that missing time, and immediately began experiencing symptoms neither of them could explain. Betty had recurring nightmares. Barney developed a ring of warts around his groin and stomach ulcers that his doctor attributed to acute stress, and both began to feel a compulsion, almost a dread, about revisiting the events of that night. It was Barney's physician who first suggested hypnosis, not as a paranormal investigative tool, but as a standard clinical technique for accessing suppressed trauma, a method still used today in treating dissociative episodes and acute stress disorders. The Hills were referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon, a respected Boston psychiatrist with no interest in UFOs and no history of pursuing sensational claims. Over a series of separate sessions, conducted individually so that neither could hear or unconsciously mirror the other's account, both Betty and Barney described independently a strikingly similar sequence of events, being stopped on the road by humanoid figures, led aboard a craft, separated from one another, and subjected to physical examinations. Betty described a needle inserted near her navel that she was told was a pregnancy test, a procedure she was informed would cause no lasting harm. Barney described a similar physical examination and a cup-like device placed over his groin that he found deeply distressing to recall even years later. The medical detail is what has kept researchers returning to this case for 6 decades. In 1961, amniocentesis as a method of testing fetal viability existed only in early experimental research circles. It would not be discussed in mainstream medical journals for the general public for several more years, and it would not be common clinical knowledge for a New Hampshire social worker and postal employee until much later still. Betty Hill described, under hypnosis, a procedure that closely resembled a diagnostic method for assessing reproductive viability, using a needle inserted into the abdominal cavity. Years before, this would have been something she could reasonably have encountered in a newspaper, a doctor's office, or casual conversation. Skeptics have argued that fertility science was advancing rapidly through the early 1960s and that some diffuse cultural awareness of experimental techniques could have reached a well-read layperson through channels that left no trace in the historical record. It's a plausible objection. It is also, notably, unfalsifiable in either direction. There is no way, 60 years later, to prove Betty Hill did or did not encounter this information through some forgotten source. What can be said is that no such source has ever been identified, despite extensive effort by researchers looking to debunk the case, and that the alternative explanation, that this detail was manufactured from nothing by 2 independently hypnotized subjects who had never discussed it with one another, asks its own difficult questions. Betty Hill also described something during her hypnotic recall that would become, unintentionally, one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in UFO history, a star map. She recalled being shown a three-dimensional display depicting a pattern of stars and being told, in a manner she interpreted as a kind of navigational lesson, where the beings had traveled from and where they intended to go. After the sessions, she sketched what she remembered from memory. In 1969, an amateur astronomer and schoolteacher named Marjorie Fish, working independently and using newly available data from the Gliese catalog of stellar distances, attempted to match Betty's sketch to actual three-dimensional stellar positions rather than the flat, two-dimensional star charts typically used at the time. After years of painstaking work, building physical models with beads on wires to represent stars at their true relative distances, Fish proposed a match centered on the star system Zeta Reticuli, roughly 39 light-years from Earth. The match was compelling enough that it was published and debated in astronomical circles for years, though later critics pointed out that with dozens of visible stars to choose from and considerable flexibility in how the sketch could be oriented, a statistically plausible match was almost inevitable given enough attempts. The star map has never been definitively validated or dismissed. It remains one of those pieces of evidence that sits permanently in the gray area this investigation keeps returning to, too specific to wave away entirely, too uncertain to serve as proof. What ties the Hill case directly into the subject of this documentary, rather than leaving it as a standalone abduction story, is a detail that receives less attention than the star map, but arguably matters more to our investigation: Betty Hill's account of a needle test, framed explicitly by the beings performing it, as a pregnancy or reproductive assessment. This was, as far as researchers can determine, the first documented instance in modern UFO literature of an abduction narrative containing an explicitly reproductive or genetic component. Every hybrid case that follows in the decades after, the Jacobs cases, the Mack cases, the thousands of testimonies collected by field investigators throughout the 1980s and 90s, echoes this same structural element, an examination focused not on curiosity about human anatomy in general, but specifically and repeatedly on reproductive material. If the Hill case is the point of origin for the modern abduction narrative as a whole, it is also, more specifically, the point of origin for the hybrid narrative that would come to dominate the field a generation later. It's worth noting what happened to the Hills after their story became public, because it establishes a pattern that recurs throughout hybrid testimony to this day. Barney Hill died in 1969 at 55 of a cerebral hemorrhage that his family and friends directly attributed to the prolonged stress of living with an experience he could never fully resolve or escape. Betty Hill continued reporting UFO sightings for decades afterward, developing a reputation among some researchers as increasingly credulous in her later identifications of ordinary aircraft as extraterrestrial craft, a shift that skeptics point to as evidence of a psychological vulnerability that colored her original account, and that believers point to as the natural result of a woman who had been permanently sensitized to the sky after an experience that shattered her sense of what was possible. Both readings can be true at once. A person can have one extraordinary, well-corroborated experience early in life and become, afterward, less reliable in distinguishing subsequent ordinary events from extraordinary ones. That complexity does not erase the original case. It simply means the original case has to be evaluated on the strength of the 1961 evidence and testimony alone, not on everything Betty Hill said in the following 3 decades. The Hill case did not exist in a vacuum, though it is the best-known early case in the English-speaking world. 4 years earlier, in 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas reported an encounter that in some respects is even more directly relevant to the hybrid question, though it received far less mainstream attention at the time, likely due to its far more explicit sexual content and its origin outside the American media ecosystem that would come to dominate UFO discourse. Villas-Boas reported being taken aboard a craft after his tractor stalled in a field near his family's farm, where he was examined by small humanoid figures and then left alone with a woman he described as strikingly attractive by human standards, but subtly non-human in her proportions. A small chin, wide-set eyes, and hair that seemed unnaturally fine and pale. He reported a sexual encounter with this woman that he did not experience as coerced in a violent sense, but described as strange and disorienting, and he recalled that before leaving, she gestured toward her abdomen and then toward the sky in a manner he interpreted, even at the time, as suggesting that she intended to raise a child conceived from their encounter somewhere off of Earth. Villas-Boas told his story to a physician shortly after the event and underwent a physical examination that documented radiation burns and lesions consistent with his account of exposure to some kind of energy field, a detail that has never been fully explained by conventional means. He maintained the same account, without variation, for the rest of his life, going on to become a lawyer and living an otherwise completely ordinary existence, never profiting from or publicly dramatizing his story beyond the initial report. Researchers who interviewed him decades later found no inconsistency in his account and no evidence of a financial or psychological motive for maintaining a fabrication across an entire lifetime. Whatever happened to Antonio Villas-Boas in that field in 1957, he carried the same story to his grave in 1991, and it stands today as one of the earliest documented cases explicitly describing what researchers would later categorize as a reproductive hybrid encounter. Years before Betty Hill's needle test and decades before the term hybrid program would enter the UFO research lexicon at all. Taken together, these two cases, separated by 4 years, an ocean, and completely different cultural contexts, establish something researchers in this field consider foundational. The reproductive element in abduction testimony was present from nearly the very beginning of the modern era, not invented later by researchers looking to build a more sensational narrative, and not the product of cultural cross-contamination between witnesses who had no access to each other's accounts. Villas-Boas never heard of Betty Hill. Betty Hill, when she underwent hypnosis in 1964, had almost certainly never heard of a Brazilian farmer's testimony from 7 years earlier, published mostly in Portuguese-language sources with minimal English translation available at the time. Two people, on two continents, with no means of influencing one another, independently produced accounts centered on human reproductive material being of interest to non-human beings. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, a reflection of some universal element of human psychology that manufactures this specific narrative under specific conditions of stress or altered consciousness, or it is evidence, however circumstantial, that something consistent was actually happening to both of them. This is the foundation the rest of the hybrid phenomenon was built on. Over the next 20 years, isolated cases like these would accumulate slowly, largely uncoordinated, reported to local police, family physicians, and the occasional sympathetic journalist, with no centralized effort to catalog or cross-reference them. That would begin to change in the 1980s, when a new generation of researchers, armed with clinical hypnosis training and a growing awareness that these cases might represent a coherent, trackable phenomenon rather than a series of unrelated anomalies, began the work of building the first real case files. It's to that era, and to the two men most responsible for transforming isolated testimony into something resembling a body of evidence, that we turn next. By the early 1980s, the abduction phenomenon had accumulated roughly 2 decades of scattered testimony, but it lacked something every emerging field of study needs before it can be taken seriously, even within its own community: methodology. Isolated cases like the Hills or Villas-Boas's were compelling precisely because they were isolated. Rare enough to feel exceptional, rare enough that no one had yet asked the harder question of what a large dataset of such cases, examined side by side, might reveal. That question fell, largely by accident of career path, to a historian named David Jacobs, who was completing his doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin on the social history of the UFO phenomenon itself, treating it as a subject worthy of serious academic inquiry, regardless of whether the underlying claims were literally true. Jacobs approached the material the way a historian approaches any contested archive, not by assuming truth or falsehood at the outset, but by asking what the pattern of testimony, taken as a body of evidence, actually showed. What Jacobs found, as he began conducting his own hypnotic regression interviews with self-reported abductees through the 1980s and into the 1990s, was that the reproductive element present in the Hill and Villas-Boas cases was not an isolated feature of two unusually detailed encounters. It was, according to his growing case files, close to a universal structure underlying the majority of abduction reports involving repeated, lifelong contact rather than a single isolated incident. Subjects described a developmental sequence that unfolded over years, sometimes decades. Childhood encounters focused on observation and what subjects described as familiarization, adolescent and early adult encounters involving reproductive material collection, and then, later in life, a shift toward what Jacobs termed presentation events, moments where subjects were shown infants or young children they were given to understand were genetically related to them. This sequence appeared, according to Jacobs's records, across hundreds of subjects with no connection to one another, no shared support group, and in many cases, no prior exposure to abduction literature at all before their own hypnotic sessions began surfacing these memories. Jacobs was careful, in his published work, to distinguish between what subjects reported experiencing and what could be independently verified, and he was equally clear that he found the implications of his own data disturbing rather than validating. His 1998 book on the subject did not read as triumphant confirmation of extraterrestrial contact. It read, by his own account and by the account of colleagues who reviewed his methodology, as the record of a researcher who had begun his work skeptical and had grown, over 15 years of first-hand interviews, increasingly convinced that something systematic and non-consensual was being done to a significant number of people, and that the endpoint of that system appeared to be the production of a hybrid population whose exact purpose remained genuinely unknown even to many of the subjects who believed themselves to be part of its creation. This is an important distinction to sit with. Jacobs was not arguing that his subjects were lying, nor was he arguing that alien visitation was definitively proven. He was arguing that the internal consistency of the testimony, gathered independently across hundreds of cases, was difficult to explain through any single alternative model. Not cultural contamination alone, not sleep paralysis alone, not a shared psychiatric syndrome alone, without leaving significant portions of the pattern unaccounted for. Working in a parallel but distinct track during roughly the same period was John Mack, whose credentials gave the field a level of institutional weight it had never had access to before. Mack did not begin his involvement with abduction research as a believer looking for confirmation. He began, by his own repeated public statements, as a skeptical Harvard psychiatrist who was persuaded to interview a handful of self-described abductees purely out of professional curiosity, expecting to find straightforward evidence of psychopathology, cultural delusion, or attention-seeking behavior that could be treated and resolved through conventional psychiatric methods. What he found instead, and what he would spend the rest of his career trying to understand, was a subject population that did not fit the profile of any recognized psychiatric disorder. His subjects were not, by clinical evaluation, disproportionately prone to psychosis, dissociative identity disorder, or fantasy proneness compared to the general population. They were, in the majority of cases Mack documented, functioning adults, professionals, parents, people with no history of mental illness, who had stumbled into an experience they could not integrate into their existing understanding of reality, and who were, in Mack's clinical assessment, exhibiting symptoms consistent with genuine trauma rather than fabrication or delusion. Mack's 1994 book compiled dozens of detailed case studies, and it was this book, along with his growing public profile on the subject, that triggered Harvard Medical School's unprecedented decision to convene a confidential committee to review his clinical work. not for malpractice in the traditional sense, but effectively for the content and direction of his research itself. An action so unusual for a tenured full professor that it drew criticism even from colleagues who had no particular sympathy for UFO research, on the grounds that it represented a dangerous precedent for academic freedom, regardless of the subject matter involved. The 14-month review concluded in 1995 with Harvard reaffirming Mack's right to pursue his research and his freedom to hold and publish his clinical conclusions, a resolution that Mack and his supporters described as a vindication and that his critics described as an institution reluctantly protecting a tenured professor's academic freedom while still harboring serious doubts about his judgment. Both things were likely true simultaneously. What the episode demonstrated beyond dispute was the extraordinary institutional risk Mack had knowingly taken on, risk that makes little sense under any theory that he was chasing fame, money, or professional advancement. A Harvard psychiatry chair with a Pulitzer Prize does not need alien abduction research to build a legacy. If anything, the subject threatened to erase the legacy he had already built, and he pursued it anyway, a fact his defenders consistently point to as evidence that he believed, on the basis of the clinical evidence in front of him, that he had found something too important to abandon, regardless of professional cost. What Jacobs and Mack converged on, working independently and using different interview methodologies, was a description of the hybrid beings themselves that showed remarkable consistency across their combined case files, encompassing well over 500 subjects between them by the mid-1990s. The physical description that emerged was not the classic little green man of pulp science fiction, nor the sleek, otherworldly gray commonly depicted in the era's popular UFO iconography. It was something explicitly, deliberately in between. Subjects described infants and children with skin tone closer to human pallor than the smooth gray commonly associated with the presumed parent alien species, but still notably pale, sometimes with a faint grayish or yellowish undertone. The eyes were consistently described as larger than human proportion, but smaller than the enormous wraparound eyes attributed to the grays in most accounts. Almond-shaped, often with a color subjects struggled to categorize using ordinary color vocabulary, frequently described as a pale blue, gray, or amber that seemed to shift depending on lighting. Hair, when present, was almost universally described as extremely fine, sparse, and pale, sometimes entirely absent in the youngest hybrids reported. Limbs were consistently described as thin, sometimes disproportionately so relative to the torso, and the head-to-body ratio skewed larger than typical human infant proportions, though notably less extreme than the disproportion typically attributed to adult gray beings. This consistency matters for a specific methodological reason that both Jacobs and Mack emphasized in their published work. The subjects who provided these descriptions were, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, not in contact with one another prior to their hypnotic sessions, had not read each other's testimony, and in many cases had minimal to no prior exposure to abduction literature that might have supplied them with a template to unconsciously reproduce. A shared cultural image of aliens from film and television absolutely existed by the 1980s and 90s and cannot be ruled out as a contributing factor to some details, but the specific granular consistency of an in-between physical form, not fully gray, not fully human, occupying a narrow and specific band of description across hundreds of independent accounts, is harder to explain purely through cultural osmosis because that particular hybrid image was not, at the time these cases were being documented, a widely circulated trope in mainstream film or television. Popular culture in this era was saturated with images of grays and little green men. It was not saturated with images of pale, sparse-haired, almond-eyed infant hybrids. If subjects were unconsciously drawing from cultural stock imagery, the imagery consistently produced does not match what was actually available in that stock at the time, a gap that researchers in the field consider one of the more difficult details for the pure fantasy explanation to account for. Both Jacobs and Mack also documented, with a consistency that unsettled them both in different ways, the emotional dimension of these presentation encounters. Subjects did not describe being shown these hybrid infants with clinical detachment, the way one might view an unfamiliar medical specimen. They described being compelled, sometimes forcibly and sometimes through what they experienced as an overwhelming and unwanted internal pull to hold, comfort, or interact with the child, and they described feeling something they could not fully rationalize afterward. A bond, a tenderness, sometimes grief at being separated from a child they had held for what felt like only minutes and would likely never see again. Mack, in his clinical notes, repeatedly flagged this as one of the most psychologically significant and hardest to fake elements of the testimony, because genuine attachment responses of this specific character are difficult to consciously manufacture and are not the emotional signature typically associated with fear-based hallucination, sleep paralysis episodes, or the confabulated memories associated with poorly conducted hypnosis. Fear is easy to imagine producing under stress. A specific, complicated grief over a half-remembered infant is a much stranger thing for the human mind to invent from nothing. Neither Jacobs nor Mack ever claimed to have proven the existence of an alien hybridization program in any way that would satisfy a physicist or a courtroom. Both were working entirely from testimonial and clinical evidence, gathered largely under hypnosis, a method whose reliability remains genuinely and legitimately contested within psychology, particularly regarding the risk of inadvertently implanting false memories through leading questions, a risk both researchers acknowledged and attempted, with varying degrees of success according to their critics, to guard against through careful interview protocols. What they built, together and separately, was not proof. It was the first systematic case file, drawn from hundreds of independent sources, describing a phenomenon with enough internal consistency that it could no longer be dismissed as a handful of isolated cranks telling unrelated stories. It gave the hybrid phenomenon its shape for the first time, a shape that later researchers, whistleblowers, and physical evidence would either reinforce or challenge in the years that followed. And it's to those later threads, and to the physical evidence that began to accompany the testimony, that we turn next. Testimony alone, no matter how internally consistent, can only carry an investigation so far before the natural and reasonable question arises: is there anything beyond memory, anything that exists independently of what a person recalls under hypnosis, that can be examined, measured, or verified? For a phenomenon built almost entirely on subjective recollection, the presence of physical evidence, however fragmentary, however contested, carries disproportionate weight because it represents the one category of proof that does not depend on the reliability of human memory or the good faith of the person recounting it. Over the decades this field has developed, a small number of physical evidence categories have recurred often enough to warrant serious examination: unexplained scarring, so-called scoop marks and implants, radiation and electromagnetic anomalies measured at reported encounter sites, and a smaller, more contested category involving biological material collected either from claimed encounter locations or from the bodies of experiencers themselves. Scarring is the most commonly reported physical evidence in abduction and hybrid testimony, and it is also the most difficult to evaluate conclusively, precisely because scars are, by their nature, ambiguous artifacts that can result from a near infinite number of ordinary causes. What makes the abduction-related scarring literature worth examining rather than dismissing outright is not any individual scar, but the pattern researchers claim to observe across cases. Small, straight-line incisions, typically a few centimeters in length, appearing most frequently on the shin, the inner forearm, or behind the ear, often noticed by the subject only after waking from an encounter they otherwise could not consciously recall, and frequently described by the subjects themselves as healing unusually quickly and without the typical inflammation, scabbing, or infection risk associated with an equivalent wound from a known cause. Investigators including Jacobs and, later, researchers working with more clinical documentation standards began photographing and cataloging these marks systematically through the 1990s, building comparative archives intended to establish whether a consistent physical signature existed across geographically and socially unconnected subjects. Skeptics have reasonably pointed out that shins and forearms are among the most commonly scarred parts of the human body from entirely mundane causes: furniture, shaving, minor accidents people forget within days, and that confirmation bias could easily lead someone already primed by hypnotic suggestion to reinterpret an ordinary, forgotten scar as evidence of something extraordinary. This is a legitimate and largely unanswerable objection for any individual case. It becomes harder to apply uniformly across the cases where the scar's sudden appearance was independently noticed and remarked upon by a spouse, roommate, or co-worker on a specific date that could later be cross-referenced against a reported missing time event the observer had no prior knowledge of. A smaller subset of cases, but one that removes the confirmation bias explanation from at least part of the dataset. The category of so-called implants carries more evidentiary weight in the eyes of researchers and considerably more controversy because, unlike a scar, an implant is a discrete physical object that can, at least in principle, be surgically removed and independently analyzed by a laboratory with no stake in the outcome. The most extensively documented implant cases were compiled by Roger Leir, a podiatric surgeon who, working with a team of physicians beginning in the mid-1990s, removed small objects from the bodies of self-reported abductees who had been shown, through X-ray or MRI imaging, to have unexplained foreign objects embedded in soft tissue with no corresponding medical history to account for their presence. No prior surgery, no injury consistent with a foreign body entering through the skin, and in several cases, no visible entry scar, despite the object being lodged well beneath the surface. Lear's team removed over a dozen such objects between 1995 and the early 2000s and submitted several for independent laboratory analysis at facilities including New Mexico Tech and a materials science lab affiliated with Los Alamos National Laboratory researchers working outside their official capacity. The results, published in limited peer-reviewed and conference settings rather than a major mainstream journal, described objects with unusual isotopic ratios and a thin, biological membrane-like coating that formed around the object in a manner the analyzing scientists described as inconsistent with the body's typical foreign body immune response, which normally produces a fibrous scar capsule rather than the kind of vascularized, seemingly deliberately integrated tissue interface some of these objects displayed. It is important, in the interest of the same rigor this investigation has applied throughout, to state plainly what these results do not establish. They do not establish extraterrestrial origin. Unusual isotopic ratios and atypical tissue responses can, in principle, result from terrestrial manufacturing processes, contamination during handling, or degradation of the sample between removal and analysis. All objections raised by mainstream materials scientists who reviewed summaries of Lear's published findings and remained unconvinced that the methodology ruled out conventional explanations to a rigorous scientific standard. No object recovered through this line of research has ever been definitively traced to a known terrestrial manufacturing source, but the absence of a known terrestrial source is not, on its own, proof of an extraterrestrial one. It may simply reflect the limits of what independent labs operating outside a controlled chain of custody can determine. What can be said with more confidence is that a genuine, documented, imaging-confirmed foreign object was surgically removed from a living person's body in each of these cases, that the removal was performed by licensed medical professionals under standard surgical conditions, and that the resulting material was submitted to legitimate, credentialed laboratories rather than fringe operations with an obvious motive to falsify results. Whatever these objects ultimately are, they represent a rare instance in this field where testimony gave way, however incompletely, to something that could be held, weighed, and analyzed. Radiation and electromagnetic anomalies form a third category of physical evidence, and one with a somewhat longer institutional history than implant research, because government and university-affiliated investigators have, at various points since the 1960s, been willing to measure and document these anomalies even when they were unwilling to endorse the extraterrestrial explanations attached to them. The Villas-Boas case discussed earlier in this account included medically documented radiation burns consistent with his description of proximity to an energy source, examined and recorded by a physician within days of the event, well before radiation burn patterns from UFO encounters had become an established trope subjects might have unconsciously mimicked. Similar patterns recur throughout the following decades. Soil samples from reported landing sites showing localized, sometimes significant increases in background radiation compared to identical soil just meters away. Vegetation at reported encounter sites exhibiting accelerated or abnormal growth patterns later attributed by agricultural researchers to unexplained changes in soil chemistry or moisture retention rather than any confirmed radiation cause. And a smaller number of cases where investigators using calibrated Geiger counters at a reported site within hours of an event recorded readings elevated well beyond natural background levels, readings that could not later be attributed to any known industrial, medical, or naturally occurring radioactive source in the vicinity. None of these categories of physical evidence, taken individually, would satisfy the evidentiary standard required to overturn a scientific consensus, and it would be dishonest for this account to suggest otherwise. Chain of custody in nearly every case is imperfect by the rigorous standards a courtroom or a peer-reviewed journal would demand. Samples pass through the hands of researchers and investigators who, however well-intentioned, are not always trained in the strict evidentiary protocols that would be required to rule out contamination, mishandling, or unconscious bias in interpretation. What these categories of evidence do accomplish, collectively, is something narrower but still significant. They establish that the hybrid and abduction phenomenon has not remained purely testimonial across its 60-year documented history. It has, at multiple points, produced physical residue, scars that appear on specific dates witnessed by third parties, objects that can be imaged, removed, and submitted for laboratory analysis, radiation signatures measured by instruments rather than recalled from memory. That residue has never been sufficient to prove the phenomenon's extraterrestrial origin to the satisfaction of the broader scientific community. And it may never be, but it has been sufficient repeatedly to prevent the phenomenon from being fully explained away as a purely psychological or cultural artifact with no physical footprint whatsoever. And that distinction, the difference between a phenomenon that leaves no trace and one that leaves a trace no one has yet fully explained, is the reason serious researchers, including credentialed scientists who began as skeptics, have continued to take it seriously enough to keep measuring, keep analyzing, and keep asking the question this investigation is built around. It's worth noting, too, how the physical evidence and the testimonial evidence reinforce each other in ways that are easy to overlook when examining each category in isolation. The scarring pattern researchers documented, small incisions on the shin, forearm, and behind the ear, corresponds closely to the locations subjects under hypnosis independently described as sites of examination or sample collection, described by people who, in a meaningful number of cases, had not yet noticed the corresponding physical mark on their own body until after their hypnotic session prompted them to look. That sequence, a hypnotically recovered memory preceding the conscious discovery of a physical mark in the exact location described, is one of the details researchers in this field consider hardest to explain through the standard skeptical model in which cultural expectation supposedly generates false memories that are then retrofitted onto pre-existing, unremarkable scars the subject already knew about. It does not resolve the broader debate. But it is precisely the kind of detail that keeps pulling serious, credentialed investigators back into a field most of their colleagues would advise them, for the sake of their careers, to avoid entirely. With this foundation of testimony and physical evidence established, the investigation now turns to a different category of source altogether, not researchers working from the outside, gathering and analyzing the accounts of others, but individuals who have claimed, under their own names and at considerable personal and professional risk, to have worked from the inside of programs studying this material directly. It is to that testimony, the whistleblower accounts that began surfacing in greater number through the late 20th century and accelerated dramatically in recent years, that we turn next. Whistleblower testimony occupies a strange evidentiary category, distinct from both the clinical case files of researchers like Jacobs and Mack and the physical evidence examined in the previous section. A whistleblower does not claim to have experienced hybridization personally in the way an abductee does. Instead, they claim direct, professional, often documented involvement in classified or compartmentalized programs studying the phenomenon from the institutional side. as scientists, military personnel, contractors, or intelligence officers who found themselves, in the course of their ordinary duties, exposed to material they were never meant to discuss publicly. This testimony carries its own distinct risks and its own distinct credibility markers, and it deserves to be evaluated on its own terms rather than folded indiscriminately into the broader abduction literature. The most significant and most extensively corroborated whistleblower case in recent years is that of David Grush, a decorated former Air Force intelligence officer and National Reconnaissance Office representative who, in 2023, went public through congressional adjacent and inspector general channels with claims that the United States government has operated a multi-decade program to recover and reverse engineer non-human craft, and that this program includes the recovery of what he described based on briefings he received from named colleagues during his official duties as non-human biologics. Grush's case differs from nearly every prior whistleblower claim in this field in one critical respect. He did not simply publish a book or grant interviews to sympathetic outlets. He filed his claims through an urgent concern complaint to the Intelligence Community Inspector General, a formal legal mechanism that grants whistleblower protections and requires the claims to be assessed as credible and urgent before being forwarded to congressional oversight committees, which they were. This procedural detail matters enormously because it means Grush's testimony was not simply accepted uncritically by a receptive interviewer. It passed through a legal filter specifically designed to screen out claims lacking a credible basis, staffed by career intelligence officials with no institutional incentive to validate a fabricated or delusional claim. In July 2023, Grush testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee, a setting in which knowingly providing false statements constitutes a federal crime, a fact he acknowledged explicitly during his testimony. He stated under this oath that he had been informed by multiple direct colleagues, whom he identified privately to the Inspector General, though not always by name in open testimony, that the United States retained crashed non-human craft and had done so for decades, and that a small number of these recoveries included biological remains that were determined, through analysis he was told about but did not personally conduct, to be non-human in origin. He was careful, under repeated and skeptical questioning from committee members across the political spectrum, to distinguish between what he had personally witnessed, what he had been told by colleagues he considered credible, and what remained second-hand or third-hand within the compartmentalized structure he described. This distinction is important to preserve honestly. Grush has not claimed to have personally examined hybrid or non-human remains with his own eyes. He has claimed, under legal oath and with whistleblower protections attached, that people in positions to know told him such material existed and was being studied under a level of classification that placed it outside the reach of ordinary congressional oversight, even oversight typically granted to members of the intelligence committees themselves. The Pentagon's response to Grush's claims has been a study in careful, bureaucratic non-confirmation rather than outright denial. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the Defense Department body established specifically to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, stated after review that it had found no verifiable evidence to substantiate claims of retrieved non-human craft or biological material, while simultaneously acknowledging that significant portions of relevant historical program information remained difficult to fully account for due to inconsistent record-keeping across decades of compartmentalized special access programs. This is a more careful statement than a simple denial, and the distinction is not incidental. The Pentagon did not say the programs Grush described do not exist. It said it could not verify through the records available to its investigators that they do, a formulation that leaves considerable room for the possibility that record-keeping practices in deeply compartmentalized programs, by design, made verification difficult regardless of what those programs actually contained. Grush is not an isolated figure making these claims in a vacuum. His testimony arrived alongside, and was in several respects corroborated by a broader wave of former officials willing to speak on similar themes in the years surrounding his disclosure, including senior figures within the same intelligence and defense apparatus who had previously worked directly on UFO-related assessment. Christopher Mellon, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence who served across multiple presidential administrations of both parties, has for years publicly stated that credible military evidence of unidentified craft demonstrating flight characteristics beyond known human technology exists and has been improperly suppressed from serious institutional review, though Mellon has been notably more cautious than Grush about extending his own claims to include biological or hybrid material specifically, generally confining his public statements to the craft and propulsion question rather than the reproductive or biological dimension this documentary is centered on. This caution is itself informative. Mellon has every reason, given his background and ongoing relationships within the defense establishment, to speak carefully and avoid claims he cannot substantiate, and his consistent refusal to extend his own testimony into the biological hybrid territory that Grush and others have entered suggests either that his own knowledge genuinely does not extend that far, or that he judges the biological claims to rest on weaker ground than the craft and propulsion claims he is willing to stake his reputation on. A somewhat different, older thread of whistleblower testimony comes from within the pharmaceutical and biotechnology research community, and it is more fragmentary, less institutionally corroborated, and correspondingly harder to evaluate than the Grush material, but it recurs often enough across independent sources to warrant inclusion. Beginning in the 1990s and continuing intermittently since, a small number of individuals identifying themselves as former contractors or researchers within classified biological or genetics programs have come forward, almost always anonymously or under conditions of concealed identity, describing work involving genetic material that did not match known terrestrial biological baselines, sequences with structural characteristics researchers in mainstream genetics would consider anomalous, or, in a small number of specific claims, entirely absent from any known terrestrial phylogenetic tree. These claims are exceptionally difficult to verify for an obvious reason. Anonymous testimony about classified genetic research, unaccompanied by any sample, dataset, or corroborating document that can be independently examined, is functionally unfalsifiable. And this category of claim has understandably attracted a disproportionate number of fabricated or exaggerated accounts from individuals seeking attention within a community already primed to believe them. Serious researchers in this field, to their credit, generally treat this category of testimony with considerably more skepticism than the Grush material, precisely because it lacks the institutional guardrails, the legal oath, the Inspector General complaint process, the whistleblower protection statute, that give the more recent congressional testimony its comparatively stronger evidentiary footing. What ties the Grush testimony back to the hybrid phenomenon specifically, rather than leaving it as a separate story about crashed craft and reverse engineering, is a detail Grush himself addressed directly when pressed by committee members. His understanding, based on what he had been told, was that some of the recovered biological material displayed characteristics suggesting an attempt, whether ancient, ongoing, or both, to engineer a biology capable of interfacing with recovered non-human technology, a description that, while carefully hedged and second-hand, aligns unsettlingly with the integration theory of hybridization discussed earlier in this investigation, the idea that hybrid programs may exist not to help an alien species survive on Earth in the abstract, but to produce something or someone capable of moving between two worlds, biological and technological, human and non-human, in a way neither species could accomplish alone. Grush was careful not to claim certainty about the purpose behind any of this. He testified to what he had been told, by whom he considered credible sources, within a system explicitly designed to prevent verification even by the officials nominally responsible for overseeing it. This is, ultimately, the honest state of whistleblower evidence in this field as it stands today. It is stronger, more institutionally grounded, and more legally consequential than at any prior point in the 60-year history of this phenomenon, anchored by a named, credentialed officer testifying under federal oath through a legal process specifically designed to protect and validate credible claims. It is also, by its very nature, second-hand, compartmentalized, and resistant to the kind of independent verification a courtroom or a scientific journal would ultimately require. Grush has not produced a hybrid body. He has not produced a genetic sample. What he has produced is sworn testimony, backed by whistleblower statute, that people in a position to know told him such things exist. Testimony serious enough to trigger ongoing congressional inquiry, serious enough that it has not been dismissed by the very institution best positioned to dismiss it if it were baseless, and serious enough that it now stands as the strongest institutional bridge yet between the decades of individual abductee testimony examined earlier in this investigation, and the possibility that governments have known and quietly studied far more about this phenomenon than they have ever been willing to say in public. It's this bridge between what ordinary people have reported experiencing in their own bodies and bedrooms for over 60 years, and what a small number of officials now claim their own government has known and studied in secret, that the next part of this investigation examines directly, turning to the specific historical programs, declassified where possible and alleged where not, that researchers believe form the institutional backbone connecting individual testimony to organized, state-level interest in exactly the material this documentary has been tracing from the very beginning. If David Grush's testimony represents the most legally consequential recent claim connecting government institutions to non-human biological material, it is not the first time such a connection has been alleged. The history of claimed government involvement in UFO research stretches back to the earliest years of the modern phenomenon, and understanding that longer history is essential to evaluating whether recent testimony represents something genuinely new, or simply the latest chapter in a much older institutional story that has been unfolding, largely out of public view, since the years immediately following the Second World War. The United States Air Force's public involvement in UFO investigation began formally with Project Sign in 1947, the same year as the Roswell incident and the Kenneth Arnold sighting that popularized the term flying saucer in American media. Project Sign was succeeded by Project Grudge and then, most famously, by Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 until its official closure in 1969 and investigated over 12,000 reported UFO sightings across its 17-year existence. The stated purpose of Blue Book was straightforward: determine whether UFOs posed a threat to national security, and analyze whether they demonstrated any technology beyond what was currently understood. Blue Book's official closure came with a public conclusion that no evidence indicated the sightings represented technology beyond terrestrial capability, and that continued study was not warranted. What is less commonly discussed is that this public conclusion coincided almost exactly with a classified scientific review, the Condon Report, whose own internal data showed that a meaningful percentage of cases investigated, by some accountings over 20%, remained genuinely unexplained even after rigorous analysis, a statistic that sat uncomfortably alongside the report's public summary recommending the program's closure, and one that has fueled decades of suspicion that the public conclusion was written to justify a predetermined outcome rather than to accurately reflect the underlying data. This gap between internal data and public messaging is a recurring pattern throughout the institutional history of this subject, and it is the reason so much of the more sensational testimony in this field, however unverifiable, has found a receptive audience among people who are not otherwise inclined toward conspiratorial thinking. The most famous and most contested example of this pattern is the alleged Majestic 12 documents, a set of papers that surfaced in 1984 purporting to be a briefing prepared for incoming President Dwight Eisenhower in 1952, describing a secret committee of 12 senior military, intelligence, and scientific officials tasked with managing the recovery and study of a crashed craft and its occupants near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. The documents describe recovered bodies examined by military pathologists and reference an ongoing, tightly compartmentalized research effort operating outside standard congressional and even presidential oversight channels. The Majestic 12 documents remain, to this day, one of the most contested pieces of evidence in the entire field, and honest treatment of them requires acknowledging serious problems on both sides of the debate. The FBI's own forensic document analysis in the late 1980s could not definitively authenticate the papers and flagged formatting and typographic cryptographic inconsistencies that raised legitimate doubt about their origin, including date stamp formats that appeared inconsistent with standard 1952 government documentation practices. Several researchers who initially treated the documents as credible later concluded they were more likely a sophisticated disinformation effort, though motive for such an effort has never been conclusively established. Theories range from a deliberate intelligence community effort to discredit UFO researchers by feeding them a plausible forgery, to a hoax perpetrated by an individual within the research community itself seeking to enhance their own standing. What keeps the documents from being fully dismissed, even by many skeptical researchers, is that subsequent, independently obtained government records, reviewed and released decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests unrelated to the original leak, showed that a compartmentalized intelligence structure resembling the one described in the Majestic 12 papers, with a similarly restrictive need-to-know classification above top secret, genuinely existed for handling certain categories of sensitive Cold War-era programs, lending a degree of structural plausibility to the forged document's description of how such a program might have operated, even if the specific documents themselves remain unauthenticated. The Roswell incident itself, referenced directly in the Majestic 12 papers, deserves its own careful treatment because it has become so culturally saturated with both credible investigation and outright commercial exploitation that separating the two requires deliberate effort. In July 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield publicly announced, in a press release later retracted within 24 hours, that it had recovered a flying disc from a ranch outside town. The retraction, issued by the same base commander who authorized the original release, reclassified the object as a weather balloon, an explanation the Air Force would not substantially revise until 1994, when it acknowledged, following renewed public and congressional interest, that the debris actually originated from Project Mogul, a highly classified program using high-altitude balloon arrays to monitor atmospheric nuclear detonations by the Soviet Union. A program sensitive enough in 1947 that a mundane, if secret, weather balloon cover story was preferred by the Army over revealing its actual, still classified purpose. This explanation accounts credibly for the debris field itself and for the original confusion. It does not, according to researchers who have spent decades interviewing surviving witnesses, adequately account for the separate and more specific testimony collected from multiple military personnel and civilian mortuary workers stationed at the base in 1947, who independently described, often decades after the fact, and with no evident coordination, being shown or told about small, non-human bodies recovered alongside the debris and subjected to extreme and unusual secrecy protocols far beyond what a balloon array recovery, however classified its instrumentation, would typically require. This is another instance of the pattern this investigation keeps encountering. A plausible, partially verified conventional explanation exists, and it likely accounts for a genuine portion of what actually happened, while a body of independent witness testimony describes additional elements the conventional explanation does not fully cover. Skeptics reasonably note that decades later witness testimony is subject to memory distortion, cultural contamination from the Roswell mythology that grew explosively after the 1980s, and, in a small number of documented instances, outright fabrication by individuals seeking financial gain from a town that built a substantial tourism economy around the incident. Researchers who take the testimony seriously counter that a meaningful subset of these witnesses were interviewed before Roswell became a cultural phenomenon, gave consistent accounts under oath in later legal depositions related to unrelated matters, and had no discernible financial motive at the time of their original statements. Neither position fully resolves the case. What can be said with confidence is that Roswell represents the clearest instance in this entire investigation of a documented, acknowledged government cover story. The weather balloon explanation was knowingly false by the Air Force's own later admission, even if the deeper cover story, Project Mogul was itself relatively mundane. An institution demonstrated, in the very first and most famous case in the field's history, a willingness to lie to the American public about what it had recovered. That fact alone does not prove the presence of alien bodies. It does establish, beyond any reasonable dispute, that official denials in this specific historical episode cannot be taken at face value, and it is this precedent, more than any single piece of testimony, that has fueled 60 years of public distrust toward every subsequent official statement on the subject. Beyond Roswell and Majestic 12, a smaller but persistent thread of institutional testimony concerns the alleged existence of biological and genetic research programs operating under Special Access Program status, a classification level that exists specifically to compartmentalize information beyond even normal top-secret channels, restricting knowledge to a small, named list of individuals regardless of an official's general security clearance or congressional oversight role. The existence of special access programs is not itself contested or speculative. They are a documented, legally sanctioned category of classification used across the defense and intelligence community for a wide range of legitimate purposes, from weapons development to covert operations. What remains contested is whether any such program has, at any point, been dedicated specifically to the study of recovered, non-human biological material, as Grush and a small number of other officials have alleged. Senator Marco Rubio, then serving as vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, stated publicly in 2023 that he had heard directly in classified briefings from military and intelligence officials whom he found credible, describing objects with flight characteristics they could not explain, lending further institutional, bipartisan credibility to the broader claim that something genuinely anomalous has been observed and studied at a classified level, even as the specific biological and hybrid dimension of that material remains the most contested and least corroborated layer of the overall testimony. Taken together, this institutional history establishes a foundation this investigation needs before it can responsibly move forward. Government secrecy around this subject is not itself in serious dispute. It is documented, acknowledged, and in the Roswell case, admitted outright decades after the fact. What remains genuinely contested, and what no piece of testimony examined so far, not Grush's sworn statements, not the Majestic 12 documents, not the Roswell mortuary testimony, has definitively resolved, is the specific question at the center of this documentary: whether that secrecy extends to an active, ongoing hybridization program connecting recovered non-human biology to the thousands of individual human testimonies examined in the earlier parts of this investigation. The historical record shows institutions willing to lie about what they recovered. It shows a classification structure capable of hiding programs from oversight for decades at a time. It does not, on its own, show us the hybrids themselves. For that, this investigation has to return to where it began, not with governments and classified programs, but with the individual men and women who claim in the present day to be living proof that the line between the two categories of evidence, institutional and personal, may not be as separate as it first appears. Every thread this investigation has followed so far, the early cases, the clinical research of Jacobs and Mack, the physical evidence, the whistleblower testimony, the institutional history, eventually leads back to the same place. Individual people in the present day living with the consequences of an experience they did not choose and cannot fully prove. It is time to sit with that testimony directly, not as case numbers in a researcher's file, but as accounts of what it actually feels like, from the inside, to believe yourself connected to something the rest of the world is not prepared to accept as real. The self-described experiencer community that has grown since the 1980s is not a monolith, and it's important to resist flattening it into a single narrative. Within this community, researchers and experiencers themselves generally distinguish between several overlapping but distinct categories of claim. There are abductees who report reproductive material collection but no ongoing relationship with resulting offspring. There are contactees who describe being shown hybrid children during recurring encounters, sometimes across decades, developing what they describe as a real, if strange, parental bond with beings they see only rarely and under conditions they cannot control. And there is a smaller, more contested category: individuals who identify not as the parents of hybrids, but as hybrids themselves, people who believe, based on a combination of physical difference, unusual life experience, and a persistent, lifelong sense of not fully belonging to ordinary human categories, that they are the product of the very program this investigation has been tracing. This last category deserves careful, honest treatment because it is the one most vulnerable to both exploitation and easy dismissal. Self-identified hybrids describe a consistent cluster of experiences that researchers have documented across hundreds of intake interviews conducted by support and research organizations that emerged specifically to study this population. Most notably, the work compiled by researcher and therapist groups who began specializing in what they term starseed or hybrid identity cases through the 1990s and 2000s. These individuals frequently report unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, sometimes strong enough to interfere with nearby electronics in ways they and others around them have independently noticed. They report atypical physiological markers, blood pressure, and body temperature that run consistently outside typical human ranges without any diagnosed medical explanation, immune responses that seem unusually robust or unusually fragile depending on the individual, and in a smaller number of cases, blood or tissue anomalies flagged by physicians during routine testing that could not be immediately explained and were not pursued further, either because the individual declined additional testing out of fear of what it might reveal, or because the treating physician had no clinical reason to investigate further once initial concerns were ruled out. Perhaps more consistently than any physical marker, self-identified hybrids describe a psychological and emotional profile that recurs with striking regularity across otherwise unconnected individuals. A lifelong sense of profound isolation that predates any conscious memory of an encounter. An unusually intense empathic sensitivity to the emotional states of people and sometimes animals around them. Vivid and recurring dreams involving specific non-human environments and beings that began in early childhood, and a deep, often distressing sense of mission or purpose they cannot articulate but experience as absolutely central to their identity, frequently accompanied by anxiety that they are somehow failing to fulfill whatever that purpose is meant to be. Mental health professionals who have studied this population, including some affiliated with mainstream academic psychiatry departments rather than fringe research organizations, have proposed a range of explanations that do not require literal extraterrestrial hybridization to account for these patterns. Attachment trauma occurring very early in life, before verbal memory forms, can produce a lasting, unexplainable sense of alienation from caregivers and community that persists into adulthood without a specific memory to explain it. A cluster of temperament traits associated with high sensitivity, sometimes discussed clinically under the framework of sensory processing sensitivity, can produce genuine physiological differences in stress response and environmental reactivity that an individual, lacking any other explanatory framework readily available to them, might reasonably interpret through whatever cultural narrative feels most resonant to their particular experience. For some people, that narrative is a religious calling, for others, a diagnosed neurodivergence, and for a smaller number, a hybrid identity. This psychological explanation is credible, well supported by existing clinical literature on trauma and temperament, and almost certainly accounts for a meaningful portion of self-identified hybrid cases. It is also, honestly, not a complete account of the phenomenon. For the same reason, the sleep paralysis explanation was not a complete account of abduction testimony in earlier parts of this investigation. It does not, on its own, explain the cases involving independently verified, atypical physiological markers documented by treating physicians with no interest in or knowledge of the patient's self-identification at the time of testing. It does not explain cases where multiple family members across 2 or 3 generations independently report similar experiences and similar physiological patterns without having discussed the framework with one another beforehand, a pattern researchers in this field describe as generational continuity, and one that, if accurate, would align disturbingly well with the multi-generational, lineage-based structure of the hybridization program Jacobs and Mack documented decades earlier through entirely separate interview subjects. One of the most extensively documented contactee cases in recent decades comes from a woman researchers have referred to in published case studies under the pseudonym Sarah, whose account was documented over more than 15 years of interviews by a credentialed clinical psychologist working independently of both Jacobs's and Mack's earlier research networks, giving her case file a useful degree of methodological separation from the two foundational researchers examined earlier in this investigation. Sarah described a first conscious encounter at age 7, followed by a recurring pattern of contact continuing into her adult life, culminating in what she described as an ongoing, decades-long relationship with a hybrid daughter she calls by name in her own private recollections, though that name has never been published. She described watching this child age across successive encounters spaced years apart in a manner roughly, though not precisely, consistent with normal human developmental timelines, and she described increasingly complex, non-verbal communication with her that she characterized as neither telepathy in the pop culture sense nor ordinary language, but something she struggled to describe except as a direct transfer of emotional and conceptual understanding that occurred faster and more completely than spoken words allow. What makes Sarah's case methodologically interesting, beyond the internal consistency of her account across 15 years of separately conducted interviews, is that her psychologist deliberately avoided the use of hypnotic regression for the majority of the documentation period, relying instead on Sarah's spontaneous, waking recall of events, specifically to sidestep the legitimate scientific criticism that hypnosis can inadvertently shape or implant memory content through leading questioning. Sarah's account, gathered largely without hypnosis, showed the same core structural elements present in the hypnotically recovered testimony Jacobs and Mack had documented in hundreds of other subjects a decade or more earlier: reproductive material collection in adolescence, presentation of an infant in early adulthood, and a longitudinal relationship with a child who aged across subsequent encounters. The convergence between memory recovered under hypnosis in one research population and memory recalled spontaneously without hypnosis in an entirely separate research population interviewed by a different clinician using different methodology is one of the details that researchers in this field consider most significant because it removes hypnotic suggestion as a plausible sole explanation for at least this portion of the broader data set. Sarah, like the majority of experiencers whose testimony has been documented across this field, describes her relationship to these experiences in terms that resist easy categorization as either purely traumatic or purely positive. She has stated, across multiple separately conducted interviews spanning years, that she does not consider herself a victim in any simple sense, that she experiences genuine love for the child she describes, and that she has, over decades, made a kind of uneasy peace with an ongoing relationship she never consented to begin and has no ability to end. This emotional complexity, coexisting love and violation, attachment and helplessness, recurs throughout contactee testimony with enough consistency that researchers have come to regard it as a core, defining emotional signature of the phenomenon, rather than an unusual outlier. It is, notably, a very difficult emotional profile to fabricate convincingly and sustain consistently across 15 years of separate interviews conducted by a trained clinical psychologist, specifically alert to signs of fabrication or performance. People who invent stories for attention or financial gain tend, according to the clinical literature on deception, to gravitate towards simpler, more emotionally legible narratives. Pure victimhood, pure wonder, pure fear, because these narratives are easier to sustain and more satisfying for an audience. The genuinely uncomfortable emotional ambiguity that recurs across contactee testimony, the coexistence of love and coercion that most subjects seem almost apologetic about admitting to, is not the narrative a fabricator would typically choose to construct, which is one of the quieter but more persuasive reasons researchers in this field continue to take this category of testimony seriously, even when they cannot independently verify its underlying claims. What remains, after examining testimony like Sarah's, alongside the physical evidence, the clinical research, and the whistleblower accounts covered earlier in this investigation, is not proof in any conventional scientific sense. It is a body of human experience, described independently by thousands of people across decades and continents, converging on a structure too specific and too emotionally consistent to be waved away entirely, and too lacking in hard physical confirmation to be accepted as settled fact. That unresolved space between dismissal and confirmation is where this phenomenon has lived for over 60 years, and it is where the next part of this investigation goes deeper still, into the question of why, if any of this is real, it would be happening now, in this era of human history specifically, and what the proposed biological and evolutionary motives behind a hybridization program might actually look like if examined with the same rigor a geneticist would bring to any other question of interspecies reproduction. Every investigation eventually has to confront the question of motive, and this one is no exception. If even a fraction of the testimony examined so far reflects something real, not delusion, not cultural contamination, not coincidence, but an actual, organized effort involving human reproductive material, the obvious question is why. Why would a species capable of crossing interstellar distances, presumably in possession of technology far beyond anything terrestrial science can currently achieve, need anything from human biology at all? This question has occupied serious researchers in this field for decades, and while no definitive answer exists, 3 explanatory frameworks have emerged with enough internal coherence and enough grounding in actual genetic and evolutionary science to warrant careful examination rather than dismissal as pure speculation. The first framework, genetic decline, rests on a premise that is uncomfortable for a species inclined to imagine advanced civilizations as uniformly triumphant over their own biological limitations, that a sufficiently old civilization might, over tens of thousands or millions of years, face genetic problems that outstrip its own ability to solve them internally. This is not as far-fetched a concept as it may initially sound. Population geneticists studying isolated terrestrial populations, certain island species, small founder populations of endangered animals, and historically isolated human communities have well documented the phenomenon of genetic bottlenecking, in which a population that becomes too genetically uniform over successive generations loses the diversity needed to adapt to new pathogens, environmental changes, or accumulated deleterious mutations that a healthier, more diverse gene pool would simply filter out through ordinary selection. A species that reproduced entirely within a closed population for a sufficiently long span of time, whether due to the biological isolation of extended space travel across generations or simply the accumulated effect of a very long-lived, low mutation rate biology, could plausibly reach a point where its own genome no longer contains the raw material needed to solve emerging biological problems. Introducing genetic material from an outside population, a population that had continued to face and adapt to a full range of environmental and pathogenic pressures on its home planet, exactly as humans have on Earth, would, under this framework, offer exactly the kind of raw genetic diversity a genetically exhausted population would need, not to replace its own lineage, but to reinvigorate it. Testimony collected by Jacobs, Mack, and later researchers lends some circumstantial support to this framework, though it should be stated plainly that no contactee has ever claimed to receive a direct, explicit explanation of this kind from the beings they describe encountering. What subjects have reported with some consistency is a sense, sometimes communicated through what they describe as direct emotional or conceptual transfer rather than language, sometimes simply inferred from context, that the beings conducting these procedures regard human genetic material as containing something valuable, something increasingly scarce within their own population, and something they cannot synthesize or reproduce through their own biology alone. Some experiencers, including Sarah, whose case was examined in the previous part of this investigation, have described an impression, difficult to fully articulate in interviews, that the beings she encountered seemed to regard human biology with something closer to reverence or urgent need than the clinical detachment one might expect from a species performing routine research on an inferior subject. This is, admittedly, thin evidentiary ground, an emotional impression relayed through a communication method the subject herself struggles to describe precisely. It is offered here not as proof, but as the kind of consistent texture that recurs across independent testimony and that researchers in this field consider worth tracking even when it falls short of hard evidence. The second framework, environmental and physiological adaptation, approaches the motive question from a different angle entirely, focusing not on genetic health in the abstract, but on the specific, practical problem of long-term survival on a planet with a very different atmospheric composition, gravitational field, and microbial environment than wherever this hypothesized species originates. If the beings described across decades of testimony are not native to Earth, and if they intend a long-term or permanent presence here rather than periodic visitation, they would face the same fundamental problem any organism faces when introduced to a genuinely foreign environment. A biology optimized for one set of conditions is rarely optimal and is sometimes fatally maladapted for another. Terrestrial biology offers a useful analogy here, one grounded in actual evolutionary science rather than speculation. Human populations that migrated to high-altitude environments, like the Tibetan Plateau over thousands of years, did not simply tolerate low oxygen levels through willpower or technology. They underwent measurable, heritable genetic adaptation, including a well-documented variant in the EPAS1 gene that alters hemoglobin regulation and appears to have entered the Tibetan population through interbreeding with the Denisovans, an archaic human population now extinct as a distinct lineage, but whose genetic contribution persists functionally within modern Tibetan populations today. This is not speculative hybrid theory. It is established, peer-reviewed population genetics, and it demonstrates a real, terrestrial precedent for exactly the mechanism this framework proposes. A population facing survival pressure in an unfamiliar environment, acquiring, through interbreeding with a population already adapted to that environment, the specific genetic tools needed to survive there long-term, tools that could not have been developed as quickly or at all through the incoming population's own unassisted evolution. Applied to the hybrid hypothesis, this framework suggests that whatever species is described across this testimony may not be attempting to replace or dilute its own lineage so much as build, across many generations, a population capable of tolerating Earth's specific atmospheric and biological conditions without the need for the kind of protective equipment or environmental support systems that shorter-term visitation would require. This would also, notably, help explain a detail that recurs throughout hybrid testimony and that researchers have struggled to account for under other frameworks. The described physical characteristics of hybrid children as an intermediate form, not identical to either presumed parent population, but a specific blend that shifts across successive generations, described in longitudinal contactee testimony like Sarah's, toward what several researchers, including Jacobs in his later published work, have characterized as an increasingly human-passing physical profile in reportedly later generation hybrids compared to earlier ones. If accurate, and this remains testimony rather than confirmed data, it would suggest a program with a directional trajectory, not a static or repeated procedure, but an iterative one, refining across generations toward a specific physiological outcome, which is precisely the pattern one would expect from a genuine, long-term adaptive breeding program rather than a one-time or purely extractive genetic sampling effort. The third framework, integration, is the most unsettling of the three, and also the one that connects most directly to the whistleblower testimony examined earlier in this investigation, including the fragments of David Grush's sworn testimony suggesting recovered biological material may relate to an effort to interface biology with recovered, non-human technology. Under this framework, the goal of a hybridization program is not primarily about the health or survival of the originating species in the abstract sense the first two frameworks propose, but about the deliberate creation of a population able to move between two worlds, capable of passing physically and psychologically as human within human society, while retaining some biological or cognitive characteristic that serves a purpose not yet disclosed to the hybrids or contactees themselves. This is the framework experiencers themselves seem most conflicted about. And it's worth noting that very few contactees interviewed across the major research programs describe feeling confident. They understand the true purpose behind their experiences, even after decades of ongoing contact. Sarah, again, is representative here. She has stated across multiple interviews that despite 15 years of documented, ongoing relationship with a hybrid child she describes with genuine parental attachment, she does not claim to know with any confidence what larger purpose that relationship ultimately serves, and she has expressed, at various points, both hope that the purpose is benevolent and unease that it might not be, without ever resolving that tension one way or the other. This uncertainty, uncomfortable as it is, may itself be the most honest data point available to this investigation. A species, or an individual, engaged in a genuinely long-term, generational project rarely explains its full strategic reasoning to the raw materials of that project, whether those materials are aware and sentient or not, a pattern with uncomfortable terrestrial precedent in humanity's own history of animal breeding programs, in which the animals involved are never informed of nor capable of understanding the specific traits being selected for across the generations of their own bloodline. If a hybridization program is real, and if it is being conducted by a species with a communication and consent framework as fundamentally different from human norms as everything else about this phenomenon suggests, it may simply be the case that full disclosure of motive was never part of the program's design, regardless of which of these three frameworks, or what combination of all three, ultimately proves closest to the truth. None of these frameworks can be tested directly with the evidence currently available to this investigation, and honest researchers in this field acknowledge that plainly, rather than overselling any one explanation as confirmed. What they offer instead is a way of organizing 60 years of otherwise disconnected testimony into something resembling a coherent hypothesis space: genetic necessity, environmental adaptation, and long-term integration. Three motives that are not mutually exclusive and could, in fact, operate simultaneously as complementary goals within a single extended program. It is with this hypothesis space in mind that the investigation now turns to a question that follows naturally from the adaptation and integration frameworks specifically. If hybrid individuals are, as some researchers and self-identified hybrids themselves claim, already living among the general population, largely unaware of, or only partially aware of their own origins, what would that actually look like in practice? It's to the testimony of people who believe they have identified, or lived alongside, individuals fitting this description that the next part of this investigation turns. If hybrid individuals genuinely exist and move through ordinary human society, largely undetected, the natural next question is what evidence, if any, would actually distinguish them from anyone else? This is where the investigation moves into its most speculative and most carefully scrutinized territory, because the claims here are harder to anchor to clinical research or sworn congressional testimony and rely instead on a patchwork of self-report, family observation, and pattern recognition assembled by researchers working closely with the experiencer community over several decades. It's important to state, before going further, that this category of the phenomenon is the one most vulnerable to both wishful self-identification and outright exploitation by people looking to profit from a receptive audience, and any serious treatment of it has to hold that vulnerability in view throughout. Researchers who have spent years compiling case files on self-identified hybrids and the family members who report living alongside them describe a recurring cluster of traits that goes beyond the psychological and emotional profile discussed in an earlier part of this investigation. Physically, the pattern most often cited involves subtle rather than dramatic difference. Individuals who are frequently described by others, from childhood onward, as having an unusual intensity or stillness to their gaze, eyes that appear slightly larger or more widely spaced than typical proportion without crossing into anything a stranger would consciously flag as unusual, skin that tans poorly or burns easily regardless of ethnic background, and a consistently reported sensitivity to sunlight and certain frequencies of artificial light that goes beyond ordinary photosensitivity. Researchers are careful to note that none of these traits individually would strike an outside observer as anything other than ordinary human variation, and that is, in fact, central to the claim itself. If a hybrid population exists and has been developed, as the adaptation framework from the previous part proposes, across many generations toward an increasingly human-passing physical profile, the expectation would be exactly this: subtle, marginal difference rather than obvious, cartoonish deviation from human norms. A population designed or evolved to move undetected through human society would, by definition, not look strikingly non-human. The absence of dramatic physical difference is not, under this framework, evidence against the phenomenon. It is what the phenomenon would be expected to produce if the adaptation and integration theories from the previous section hold any truth at all. This is also, and it needs to be said plainly, exactly the kind of claim structure that should raise a skeptical reader's guard, because it is unfalsifiable in a way that should concern any rigorous investigation. A theory that predicts its own evidence will be subtle, ambiguous, and indistinguishable from ordinary variation is a theory that cannot be disproven by the absence of dramatic evidence. And researchers within this field who take a more scientifically rigorous approach have raised exactly this objection internally, pushing back against colleagues who they feel have constructed a framework immune to falsification. This tension is worth sitting with rather than resolving artificially in either direction. It is entirely possible for a hybrid population to exist and be difficult to detect, precisely because successful integration was the design goal. And it is simultaneously true that this same feature makes the claim resistant to the kind of testing that would let an outside observer distinguish it from wishful pattern matching. Both things can be true. The honest position, and the one most credible researchers in the field actually hold, is that this specific subclaim, hybrids walking among us in a form indistinguishable from ordinary people, sits closer to informed speculation than established finding, even within a broader body of testimony that this investigation has treated with considerably more evidentiary weight in earlier parts. Where this category of claim gains more traction, at least among researchers who have spent years cross-referencing case files, is in reports involving multi-generational family patterns rather than isolated individual self-identification. Beginning in the late 1990s and continuing through more recent research, investigators working with the experiencer community began documenting cases in which contact experiences, physiological anomalies, and hybrid-adjacent testimony appeared not in a single individual but recurred across 3 or more generations of the same family, often with each generation initially unaware that earlier relatives had reported similar experiences, only discovering the shared pattern later in life through family conversation prompted by their own encounters. This detail matters because it removes, at least partially, the objection that a single individual constructed their identity around a hybrid framework they were independently exposed to through books, film, or online community. A much harder objection to sustain when a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, across 3 separate decades and in some documented cases 3 separate countries, each independently began reporting comparable experiences before ever discussing them with one another, only recognizing the overlap once a family conversation, sometimes prompted by a medical event or a moment of personal crisis, brought the pattern into the open. David Jacobs, in his later research through the 2000s, placed increasing emphasis on exactly this generational pattern, proposing that the hybridization program he had spent over 2 decades documenting was not, as earlier researchers, including himself, had initially assumed, a program focused on producing individual hybrid offspring who would then be raised entirely outside human society. Instead, based on the accumulating testimony in his case files, he came to believe the program's actual structure involved integrating hybrid or partially hybrid individuals directly into human families and human society across multiple generations, with each generation carrying a slightly higher proportion of what his subjects described as the alien genetic contribution, in a slow, iterative breeding structure designed to eventually produce individuals who were, for all practical purposes, fully capable of living an ordinary human life while carrying whatever biological or cognitive characteristic the broader program was ultimately designed to instill. This later conclusion, it should be noted honestly, drew significant criticism even from researchers otherwise sympathetic to Jacobs's earlier work, in part because it necessarily extrapolated more heavily beyond what any single subject's testimony could directly establish, and in part because it edged toward a claim structure, a slow, undetectable, multi-generational infiltration of human society that is difficult to distinguish from classic conspiracy thinking, regardless of the sincerity or rigor with which it is proposed. It's worth pausing here to address this tension directly, because a documentary aiming for genuine rigor owes its audience an honest accounting of where the evidence gets thinner, rather than pretending every claim in this field carries equal weight. The earlier parts of this investigation, the Hill and Villas-Boas cases, the clinical research of Jacobs and Mack in their earlier, more methodologically cautious work, the physical evidence around scarring and implants, the Grush congressional testimony, rest on a foundation that, while still short of scientific proof, involves named individuals, documented physical evidence, sworn legal testimony, and cross-referenced case files built with real methodological care. The claim that hybrids currently live among the general population, integrated and largely undetected, rests on a thinner foundation. Self-report, family pattern recognition, and the later, more speculative extrapolations of researchers who, however credible their earlier work, were reasoning beyond what their data could fully support. This does not mean the claim is false. It means it belongs in a different evidentiary category than the material examined in the first half of this investigation, and treating it with the same confidence would misrepresent the actual state of the evidence. What can be said with somewhat more confidence, because it rests on a slightly firmer evidentiary foundation than the pure integration claim, is that a substantial and apparently sincere population of people across multiple countries believe themselves to be connected to this phenomenon in exactly this way, that their accounts show meaningful internal consistency with each other despite limited direct contact between them, and that a meaningful subset of these accounts include family corroboration and physiological anomalies that predate the individual's conscious self-identification with the hybrid framework, removing at least some of the concern that they simply adopted a compelling cultural narrative after the fact and retrofitted their life experience to match it. Researchers who work directly with this population, including licensed clinicians who approach the work from a place of genuine clinical care rather than advocacy for any particular extraterrestrial theory, consistently emphasize that whatever the ultimate cause, the psychological distress and the very real physiological symptoms these individuals report are genuine and deserve to be treated with clinical seriousness, independent of whether the ultimate cause proves to be literal hybridization, an as yet poorly understood terrestrial phenomenon, or a psychological and cultural process science does not yet have adequate language to describe. That last framing deserves emphasis as this investigation moves toward its later, more synthesizing parts. It is possible, and perhaps even likely, that the full truth of this phenomenon does not sort neatly into the binary of either literal alien hybridization or complete fabrication, but instead involves some combination of genuine, currently unexplained, biological and psychological phenomena layered beneath decades of cultural narrative, individual trauma, and, in some cases, deliberate institutional obscuration, all reinforcing and complicating one another in ways that resist a single clean explanation. This is an unsatisfying conclusion for anyone hoping this investigation would end in a tidy answer, and it is worth acknowledging honestly, rather than manufacturing a false sense of resolution the evidence does not actually support. Having now examined the phenomenon from nearly every available angle, its historical origin, its clinical documentation, its physical evidence, its institutional and whistleblower dimension, and its most contested claims about present-day integration. The investigation turns next to the specific scientific objections that mainstream biology and physics raise against the hybridization hypothesis as a whole. Objections serious enough that they cannot be waved away by an investigation genuinely committed to weighing this phenomenon fairly. It's to those objections, and to how seriously they actually constrain what has been presented so far, that we turn next. No investigation into this phenomenon can claim intellectual honesty without confronting, directly and without deflection, the scientific objections that mainstream biology raises against the entire hybridization hypothesis. These objections are not the product of institutional close-mindedness or reflexive skepticism, as some proponents in this field are sometimes too quick to assume. They are grounded in well-established, thoroughly tested principles of genetics and reproductive biology, and any framework proposing human-alien hybridization has to answer them seriously or risk collapsing under its own internal contradictions. The most fundamental objection is also the simplest. Reproductive compatibility between species requires, at minimum, a shared evolutionary and biochemical foundation that two independently originated life forms, evolving on entirely separate planets under entirely separate conditions, would have essentially no reason to share. On Earth, species that can interbreed, even distantly related ones like horses and donkeys or lions and tigers, share a relatively recent common ancestor, a shared genetic code built on the same DNA structure, the same 20 amino acids, and broadly compatible chromosomal architecture. Even within this framework of shared terrestrial biology, hybridization between species that diverged tens of millions of years ago typically produces sterile offspring, if it produces viable offspring at all, because the accumulated genetic divergence between separately evolving lineages, even closely related ones, quickly exceeds the threshold required for successful chromosomal pairing during reproduction. A species that evolved independently on another planet would not share Earth's specific genetic code by any biological necessity. It might use an entirely different information storage molecule altogether, entirely different amino acid sets, or a biochemistry built on different fundamental elements. Under conventional evolutionary biology, the odds of two independently evolved lineages arriving at reproductively compatible biology by chance are vanishingly small, closer to zero than to any plausible probability a geneticist would take seriously. This objection is significant, and it deserves to be treated as the single strongest scientific argument against the literal hybridization hypothesis as presented across most of the testimony examined in this investigation. It is also, honestly, not an argument that fully closes the door, for a specific reason worth examining carefully rather than dismissing as motivated reasoning by hybrid proponents. The objection assumes independent evolutionary origin with no prior contact or intervention. If, however, the hypothesized species has been observing, studying, and in some testimony, even genetically sampling humanity for a span of time considerably longer than the 60 years of modern testimony covered by this investigation, a possibility several researchers in this field have proposed, pointing to ancient astronaut theories and disputed archaeological interpretations that fall outside the scope of what this investigation can responsibly verify. Then any hybridization program would not be relying on chance compatibility between two independently evolved genomes. It would be relying on deliberate genetic engineering, using technology capable of directly manipulating and combining genetic material at a molecular level regardless of its original biochemical compatibility, a capability that would require technology far beyond current terrestrial genetic engineering, but not necessarily beyond what a civilization capable of interstellar travel might plausibly possess. This reframing does not resolve the objection so much as relocate it. The question shifts from, could two independently evolved species interbreed naturally, to could sufficiently advanced technology overcome biochemical incompatibility through direct genetic engineering? And a second question, while still entirely speculative, is not one that current genetic science can rule out with the same confidence it rules out natural interbreeding between unrelated terrestrial species. A second, hand, related objection concerns chromosome number and structure specifically. Human cells carry 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs, a specific architecture that any viable human reproductive process, whether natural conception or advanced assisted reproduction, has to work within or around. For a hybrid embryo to develop successfully using human genetic material, some mechanism would need to reconcile human chromosomal architecture with whatever the presumed alien species' own genetic architecture might be, a problem that has no natural terrestrial precedent to draw on because nothing on Earth has ever needed to solve it. Contactee testimony offers essentially no useful data on this specific technical question for the obvious reason that the described procedures happen to and around the experiencers, not to instruments they have access to examine, and no experiencer in the literature reviewed for this investigation has claimed detailed technical knowledge of the actual reproductive or genetic engineering methodology involved. This is, candidly, one of the largest gaps in the entire body of testimony this investigation has examined, an almost complete absence of any technical detail about how the described procedures might actually function at a biological level, leaving the entire hybridization hypothesis dependent on unspecified, unfalsifiable, sufficiently advanced technology to bridge a gap that mainstream genetics considers close to insurmountable through any currently understood natural process. A third objection, raised specifically by researchers examining the described physical appearance of hybrids across the testimony compiled by Jacobs, Mack, and later researchers, concerns developmental biology and the sheer complexity of producing a viable, functioning organism through cross-species genetic combination, even setting aside the chromosomal compatibility problem already discussed. Human development from a single fertilized cell to a functioning infant involves an extraordinarily precise, tightly regulated cascade of genetic expression, with thousands of genes activating and deactivating in exact sequence and exact timing to produce viable organ systems, a functioning nervous system, and a body capable of surviving outside the womb. Introducing genetic material from an entirely different, independently evolved developmental system into this process would not simply blend two sets of traits in the way popular culture often imagines hybridization working, mixing physical features like blending paint colors. It would risk catastrophic developmental failure at almost every stage because the regulatory genetic sequences that control when and how traits are expressed are themselves species-specific and would have no reason to function correctly when combined with an entirely foreign genetic regulatory system. This is, in the assessment of several developmental biologists who have been asked to comment on the hybrid hypothesis by journalists and researchers over the years, the single most technically difficult problem the entire theory has to solve. More difficult even than the basic question of chromosomal compatibility because it concerns not just whether two genomes could combine, but whether the resulting combined genome could execute a coherent developmental program at all. These objections, taken together, represent a serious and largely unanswered scientific challenge to the literal hybridization hypothesis as presented across the testimony this investigation has examined. It would be intellectually dishonest to present the testimonial and circumstantial evidence from earlier parts of this investigation without acknowledging, directly and without minimization, that mainstream genetics and developmental biology raise objections serious enough that most credentialed scientists working in these fields regard the entire hybridization hypothesis as biologically implausible, bordering on impossible under any currently understood natural process. This is not institutional closed-mindedness. It is the application of well-tested, thoroughly validated science to a claim that, on its current evidentiary merits, has not yet produced the kind of hard physical or genetic evidence. A verified hybrid genome, a confirmed non-terrestrial biological sample, a peer-reviewed developmental biology study of actual hybrid tissue that would be required to seriously challenge the current scientific consensus. At the same time, and this needs to be stated with equal honesty rather than allowed to quietly cancel out the previous paragraph, the objections outlined here apply most forcefully to a model of natural, unassisted interbreeding between independently evolved species. They apply considerably less forcefully, though they do not disappear entirely, to a model involving deliberate, technologically mediated genetic engineering by a civilization operating with capabilities far beyond current terrestrial science. A civilization whose mere presence on Earth, if any of the testimony and whistleblower evidence examined earlier in this investigation reflects reality in any degree, already implies technological capability well beyond what mainstream physics currently considers achievable, including some resolution to the propulsion and energy requirements of interstellar or interdimensional travel that current physics cannot yet explain. An investigation that accepts, even provisionally, that a species has solved the problem of arriving here at all is on somewhat unstable ground, if it then treats the reproductive and genetic engineering problem as categorically unsolvable by the same hypothetical civilization. This is not proof that the genetic objections are wrong. It is simply an acknowledgement that the size of the technological gap the entire phenomenon already requires us to accept, if we accept any of it, makes the additional gap required by the genetic objections somewhat less categorically decisive than it would be if applied to a claim of ordinary, unassisted biological interbreeding between two natural terrestrial species. This is, ultimately, where the scientific case against hybridization actually stands. Strong, well-grounded, and almost certainly correct as applied to any model of natural interbreeding, while considerably less conclusive when applied to a model involving directed genetic engineering by a civilization whose basic presence here, if real, already implies capabilities the objections themselves cannot fully account for. Neither position should be oversold. The absence of a definitive scientific refutation is not evidence of truth, and this investigation has been careful throughout not to treat it as such. But the objections, however serious, do not close the case as cleanly as a purely skeptical reading might suggest. And it's with this qualified, honestly incomplete scientific picture that the investigation now turns to examine how governments, militaries, and international bodies have actually responded to this phenomenon in recent years, not in the classified, whistleblower-driven history covered earlier, but in the open, increasingly public policy shifts of just the last several years, which form the most immediately relevant and rapidly evolving chapter of this entire story. The last decade has seen a shift in how governments discuss this subject publicly that would have been almost unthinkable to researchers working through the more secretive decades covered earlier in this investigation. What was once relegated entirely to classified briefings, dismissed press conferences, and fringe research circles has, since roughly 2017, moved steadily into open congressional hearings, formal Pentagon offices, and mainstream news coverage that treats the underlying phenomenon, if not the hybrid-specific claims, as a legitimate subject of national security concern, rather than pure tabloid fodder. Understanding this shift matters for this investigation because it establishes the current, real-world backdrop against which all the historical and testimonial evidence examined so far now has to be understood. The turning point is generally traced to December 2017, when the New York Times published an investigation revealing the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a Pentagon initiative that had operated with limited public knowledge from 2007 to 2012, studying reported encounters between military aircraft and unidentified objects displaying flight characteristics that pilots and radar operators involved could not explain through any known aircraft technology. The story arrived with something researchers in this field had waited decades for: genuine, verifiable government video released alongside the reporting, showing Navy pilots tracking objects that accelerated, decelerated, and maneuvered in ways inconsistent with any known aerodynamic principle, all while audibly expressing genuine confusion and alarm in real time in recordings that were not staged for public consumption but pulled from routine cockpit instrumentation. This video evidence, unlike nearly everything examined earlier in this investigation, did not depend on human memory, hypnotic recall, or decades-old witness testimony. It was instrument data, corroborated by multiple independent radar and infrared tracking systems, involving trained military observers, with every institutional incentive to report accurately rather than sensationally, given the professional risk involved in publicly associating their names with UFO testimony. This disclosure triggered a cascade of institutional responses that have continued to build through the years since. The Pentagon acknowledged the program's existence and, in subsequent years, formalized its UFO investigation efforts, first through the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force in 2020, and then through the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, established in 2022, with a considerably broader mandate covering not just aerial phenomena, but objects observed underwater, in space, and across multiple domains simultaneously, a scope expansion that itself suggests the government's internal understanding of the phenomenon had moved beyond simple aircraft anomalies into something considerably stranger. In June 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment to Congress covering 144 reported incidents involving military personnel, concluding that the vast majority remained unexplained, that a small number likely represented foreign adversary technology or airborne clutter, and that a genuinely unexplained residual category displayed flight characteristics, instantaneous acceleration, sustained hypersonic velocity without any visible propulsion signature, and the ability to operate in space, atmosphere, and underwater with no apparent transition difficulty, that the report's own authors acknowledged they could not account for using any known aerospace technology, foreign or domestic. It's worth being precise about what this and subsequent government reports have and have not said, because the distinction matters enormously for this investigation's central hybrid question. Every major government assessment released since 2017 has focused almost exclusively on craft and flight characteristics. None of the unclassified government reports has made any official statement regarding biological material, hybrid programs, or genetic research of the kind discussed throughout this investigation. That silence is significant in two potentially opposite ways, and honest analysis requires holding both possibilities open simultaneously. It may reflect the straightforward reality that the biological and hybrid dimension of this phenomenon, however extensively documented in testimonial and clinical literature, has no corresponding classified government program to disclose, because it does not exist at the institutional level in the way the craft phenomenon apparently does. Or it may reflect exactly what Grush's testimony, examined earlier in this investigation, claims directly, that the biological dimension exists at a level of classification so restrictive that even the congressional oversight structure receiving these broader UAP briefings has not been read into it, placing it entirely outside the scope of what these public and semi-public reports could disclose, even if their authors wanted to. The 2023 congressional hearings, which included Grush's sworn testimony discussed earlier, also featured testimony from Navy pilots David Fravor and Ryan Graves, both of whom described first-hand encounters with unidentified objects during active military operations, testimony that corroborated the broader craft phenomenon with the same weight of direct, named, on-the-record military witness testimony that has been comparatively rare throughout the earlier decades of this field's history. Graves, notably, has gone on to found a nonprofit organization specifically focused on normalizing pilot reporting of these encounters, arguing publicly that a genuine, unaddressed safety and national security risk exists regardless of the object's ultimate origin, a framing that has helped shift the broader public conversation away from the believer versus skeptic framing that dominated earlier decades and toward a safety and disclosure framing that has proven considerably more palatable to mainstream institutions and media outlets that had previously avoided the subject entirely out of reputational caution. Internationally, the pattern of increasing openness is not confined to the United States. Though the American disclosure movement has received the most media attention, France's space agency, through its dedicated UFO study group known by its French acronym GIPAN, has maintained a formal, continuously operating investigation unit since 1977, longer than any equivalent American body, and has published detailed case files, including a persistent, unexplained category, through official government channels for decades with considerably less public controversy than the American disclosure movement has generated, largely because French institutional culture has treated the subject as a legitimate aerospace safety question from a much earlier point, rather than the reputationally fraught subject it remained in American institutional culture until very recently. Chile, Uruguay, Peru, and several other nations across South America have maintained their own government UFO investigation bodies, generally through their aviation and defense ministries, for similar reasons rooted in aviation safety rather than any particular openness to the extraterrestrial hypothesis specifically. Japan's Ministry of Defense confirmed in 2020 that it had established formal guidelines for military personnel encountering unidentified aerial phenomena. Following the same general pattern of institutional acknowledgement, the American military adopted around the same period, suggesting a degree of quiet, roughly simultaneous coordination, or at minimum parallel concern, among allied nations' defense establishments during this specific window of years. None of this international and domestic institutional movement has touched directly on the hybrid question this investigation is centered on. It has, however, fundamentally changed the credibility landscape the hybrid testimony now exists within. 60 years ago, when Betty and Barney Hill first described their experience to Dr. Simon, the broader UFO phenomenon itself carried almost no institutional legitimacy, and testimony like theirs had to stand entirely on its own internal consistency and the personal credibility of the witnesses involved. Today, the broader craft phenomenon has been substantially validated by instrument data, sworn military testimony, and formal government acknowledgement, even as the specific biological and hybrid dimension remains in the same evidentiary position it has occupied for decades, extensively documented through testimony, partially supported by physical evidence and whistleblower claims, but never institutionally confirmed. This creates an unusual and genuinely interesting evidentiary asymmetry for this investigation to sit with as it moves toward its final assessment. The broader phenomenon this hybrid testimony has always existed within is, by any reasonable current standard, real and institutionally acknowledged in a way it was not a decade ago, while the specific hybridization claims examined throughout this investigation remain exactly as unconfirmed and exactly as compelling as they have been since Betty Hill first described a needle test to a Boston psychiatrist in 1964. It's this asymmetry, a validated broader phenomenon housing an unvalidated but strikingly consistent specific claim, that the remaining parts of this investigation need to grapple with directly, moving from the historical and evidentiary record into a more synthesizing examination of what all of this actually adds up to and what it would mean for individuals and for the species as a whole. If the hybrid testimony examined across this entire investigation eventually receives the kind of institutional confirmation the broader craft phenomenon has only recently begun to receive after 60 years of comparable dismissal. Having examined the historical foundation, the clinical research, the physical evidence, the whistleblower testimony, the institutional history, and the philosophical implications of this phenomenon, the investigation now turns to the cases researchers in this field consider strongest among those documented in the past 2 decades. Cases that combine multiple categories of evidence examined separately throughout this investigation into single, more thoroughly documented incidents. The case most frequently cited by contemporary researchers as the best documented modern hybrid adjacent encounter involves a family in the American Midwest, identified in published research under pseudonyms to protect their privacy, whose experience was investigated beginning in 2011 by a team that included a licensed clinical psychologist, a retired law enforcement investigator with training in witness interview protocol, and a physician willing to review the family's medical records as part of the documentation process, giving this case an unusually multidisciplinary evidentiary foundation compared to most testimony examined earlier in this investigation. The case began when the mother of the family, referred to in case documentation as Renee, sought psychiatric evaluation for her then 9-year-old daughter after the child began describing recurring nighttime visits from what she called the quiet people, accompanied by physical symptoms including unexplained nosebleeds and a small, precise mark behind her left ear that the family's pediatrician documented and could not attribute to any injury consistent with the family's account of the child's activities in the preceding weeks. What distinguished this case from a straightforward childhood sleep disturbance, according to the investigating team's published case notes, was the corroborating detail that emerged when Renee, initially skeptical of any paranormal explanation and seeking only conventional psychiatric help for her daughter, mentioned the situation to her own mother, the child's grandmother, during an unrelated family conversation. The grandmother, without prompting and apparently unaware of the specific details Renee had not yet shared with her, described having experienced strikingly similar nighttime visitations as a child in the 1960s, including a matching detail about a mark behind the ear that she recalled her own mother, the great-grandmother, discovering and being unable to explain at the time. This spontaneous three-generation corroboration, emerging without any of the three generations having compared notes in advance or having been exposed to the broader hybrid literature that might have supplied a shared template, is precisely the kind of independent convergence that researchers in this field consider most valuable because it removes several of the standard skeptical objections regarding cultural contamination and post hoc narrative construction that apply more forcefully to single-generation isolated testimony. The investigating psychologist, working with the family over roughly 18 months, eventually obtained parental consent to conduct careful, non-leading interviews with the daughter directly, using age-appropriate, open-ended questioning specifically designed to avoid the suggestive interview techniques that have justifiably drawn criticism in other child testimony contexts, including the well-documented history of problematic interview practices in unrelated child abuse investigations during the 1980s and 90s that produced false memories through leading questioning. Using this more careful protocol, the child consistently described, across multiple separate interview sessions conducted months apart, a recurring encounter with beings she described in terms broadly consistent with the hybrid physical profile documented by Jacobs and Mack decades earlier in an entirely different research context. The child, by virtue of her age and her family's limited prior exposure to UFO literature, would have had essentially no access to. She also described in a detail the investigating team found particularly significant, an ongoing relationship with what she called her other sister, a being she described in terms consistent with the presentation and bonding pattern documented throughout contactee testimony examined earlier in this investigation, describing physical characteristics and an emotional closeness that closely mirrored, without any apparent access to the source material, elements of testimony collected from adult contactees like Sarah in research conducted years earlier and never made available to this family. This case remains under ongoing, though considerably less active, documentation by the original research team, and it has not produced the kind of hard physical evidence, a recovered implant, a verified genetic sample, that would elevate it beyond the testimonial and clinical category this investigation has repeatedly noted as the field's evidentiary ceiling. What it does represent, according to researchers who have reviewed the full case file, is one of the more methodologically careful modern documentations of the multi-generational pattern discussed in earlier parts of this investigation, conducted with attention to the specific criticisms, leading questioning, cultural contamination, post hoc narrative construction that have justifiably been leveled against less careful investigations throughout this field's history. A second frequently cited modern case involves physical evidence more directly and returns this investigation to the implant research discussed several parts earlier. In 2016, a woman in the Pacific Northwest, working with a medical team that included an orthopedic surgeon willing to treat the case with clinical seriousness after reviewing initial imaging, underwent removal of a small object from soft tissue in her forearm after an MRI, ordered for an unrelated complaint, incidentally revealed its presence. The woman had no memory of any injury or procedure that would explain the object's location, though she did report, when questioned by the treating physician, about any unusual sleep disturbances or missing time. A pattern of recurring nighttime experiences she had never previously connected to any physical cause and had not sought treatment for prior to the incidental imaging finding. The removed object was submitted to an independent university materials science laboratory, whose analysis, later summarized in a limited academic conference presentation rather than a major peer-reviewed journal, described a composition and internal structure the analyzing team characterized as unusual relative to any known manufactured or naturally occurring terrestrial material they were able to compare it against, while stopping well short of claiming a non-terrestrial origin, citing the practical impossibility of ruling out every conceivable manufacturing process with the resources available to an academic lab operating outside a controlled forensic chain of custody. This case, like the Lear implant research examined earlier in this investigation, illustrates both the promise and the persistent limitation of the physical evidence category as it currently stands. A genuine imaging-confirmed object was recovered from a living person's body under standard medical conditions, analyzed by credentialed scientists with no evident motive to fabricate results, and found to be unusual by conventional materials science standards. That finding falls meaningfully short of proof, and the researchers involved have been careful, in every published summary of the case, not to overstate what their analysis actually established. It nonetheless represents exactly the kind of case this investigation has argued throughout deserves to be weighed seriously rather than dismissed reflexively, not because it proves the hybridization hypothesis, but because it adds another data point to a physical evidence record that, however incomplete, has never been fully explained away either. A third category of recent case worth noting briefly involves the growing number of self-identified hybrids and contactees willing to undergo genetic testing through commercial consumer DNA services, a development made possible only in the last decade as this technology became widely accessible outside specialized laboratory settings. Several researchers in this field have begun collecting and comparing results from experiencers who volunteered their raw genetic data for analysis, looking specifically for unusual markers, unexplained gaps in ancestral matching, or anomalous regions the standard commercial algorithms flag as difficult to classify. This research remains in its early stages, complicated significantly by the fact that consumer genetic testing platforms are designed and calibrated specifically to identify known human ancestral populations and are neither designed nor validated to detect or characterize genuinely novel, non-terrestrial genetic material, meaning an anomalous or unclassifiable result from one of these platforms is at least as likely to reflect a limitation of the testing methodology itself as it is to reflect anything genuinely unusual about the sample being tested. No result from this line of research has yet been independently replicated or validated through more rigorous, purpose-built genetic sequencing methodology, and researchers in the field who take this approach seriously have generally been appropriately cautious about the current limitations, treating it as a promising future avenue for evidence gathering rather than a source of confirmed findings today. Taken together, these recent cases illustrate something important about where this field currently stands, roughly 65 years after Betty and Barney Hill first described their experience to a Boston psychiatrist. The evidentiary categories available to researchers have not fundamentally changed: testimony, physical evidence of ambiguous but unusual character, and institutional testimony that stops short of full confirmation. What has changed is the methodological care with which that evidence is now being gathered, the multidisciplinary teams increasingly willing to participate in its documentation, and the broader institutional climate examined in the previous parts of this investigation that has made government and scientific engagement with the underlying UFO phenomenon considerably more legitimate than it was even a decade ago. Whether that improving methodological and institutional climate will eventually produce the kind of definitive evidence this field has lacked for over 60 years remains, as it always has, an open question. It's to that open question, and to what a realistic assessment of the phenomenon's likely future trajectory looks like, that the investigation turns in its final parts. Any fair assessment of where this field is likely headed has to begin by acknowledging a structural problem that has shaped its entire 65-year history and shows no sign of resolving on its own: the mismatch between the kind of evidence this phenomenon has produced and the kind of evidence mainstream science requires before it will engage with a claim seriously. This mismatch is not, as some proponents in the field sometimes argue, simply a matter of institutional stubbornness or reputational cowardice among scientists who privately suspect something is real but publicly refuse to say so. It reflects a genuine and reasonable epistemic standard. Science requires evidence that can be independently reproduced, physically examined by multiple unaffiliated laboratories, and evaluated without dependence on the reliability of human memory or the good faith of any single witness. The hybrid phenomenon, across every category of evidence examined throughout this investigation, has consistently fallen short of that standard, not because the testimony is necessarily false, but because the nature of the claimed experiences, covert, unpredictable, resistant to instrumentation, and centered on subjective recall, makes that standard extraordinarily difficult to meet, even if every word of every account examined in this investigation is completely true. This is worth sitting with directly because it explains why a phenomenon with as much accumulated testimony, as much internal consistency, and as much circumstantial physical evidence as this one has never crossed the threshold into mainstream scientific acceptance, even as the broader UFO and UAP phenomenon has, in just the last several years, made exactly that crossing. The craft phenomenon examined in an earlier part of this investigation succeeded in gaining institutional legitimacy, specifically because it eventually produced the kind of evidence science is built to evaluate: instrument data, radar corroboration, and video captured through standard military equipment operating under normal conditions, all generated independently of human memory or testimony. The hybrid phenomenon has never produced an equivalent category of evidence, and there is a reasonable argument, grounded in the nature of the claimed encounters themselves, for why it may never be able to. If hybridization involves covert biological procedures conducted on individuals during periods they cannot consciously access or control, the phenomenon is, almost by definition, structured in a way that resists the kind of instrumented, reproducible documentation that resolve the craft question. This is not a satisfying answer for anyone hoping this investigation would end with a clear prediction of imminent confirmation. It is, however, the most honest assessment available, given everything examined across the previous 13 parts of this investigation. That said, several concrete developments currently underway suggest the evidentiary landscape may shift meaningfully in the coming years, even if full confirmation remains distant. Genetic sequencing technology has continued to fall in cost and rise in accessibility at a pace that has genuinely surprised researchers in adjacent fields, and the kind of purpose-built, rigorous genetic analysis that the consumer DNA testing discussed in the previous part of this investigation cannot currently provide is becoming steadily more feasible for independent research teams to conduct directly, without requiring the cooperation of a government laboratory or an academic institution wary of reputational risk. Several researchers in this field, including some with genuine credentials in molecular biology, who have entered the field specifically because they consider the genetic question testable in principle, even if it has not yet been adequately tested in practice, have begun discussing plans for more rigorous, purpose-built genetic studies of self-identified hybrid and contactee populations, studies designed from the outset to withstand the kind of scientific scrutiny that has undermined less careful efforts in the past. Whether any such study will actually produce a result significant enough to warrant broader scientific attention remains, of course, entirely unknown, but the technical capability to conduct a genuinely rigorous test of at least the genetic dimension of this phenomenon is closer to hand today than it has been at any prior point in this field's history. The institutional and governmental trajectory examined in an earlier part of this investigation also shows every sign of continuing rather than reversing the all-domain anomaly. Resolution Office continues to operate with an expanding mandate. Congressional interest in the broader UAP question has remained bipartisan and sustained, rather than fading as a passing news cycle, and the whistleblower testimony pipeline that produced David Grush's 2023 disclosure appears, based on public statements from members of the relevant congressional oversight committees, to include additional individuals considering similar disclosures through the same legal whistleblower protection channels, suggesting Grush's testimony may prove to be the first significant disclosure in this specific legal category rather than an isolated event. Should any subsequent whistleblower testimony address the biological and hybrid dimension of this phenomenon more directly and with more specificity than Grush's necessarily second-hand account provided, it would represent a meaningful escalation in the evidentiary weight available to this investigation's central question, moving the hybrid-specific claim closer to the institutional legitimacy the broader craft phenomenon has already achieved. It is also worth noting, in the interest of complete honesty about the field's likely trajectory, the countervailing forces that could just as easily suppress or discredit this line of inquiry, regardless of its underlying truth. The UFO and UAP field, now that it carries genuine institutional and financial legitimacy for the first time in its history, has begun attracting exactly the kind of bad faith actors, financially motivated fabricators, and attention-seeking claimants that any newly legitimized field eventually draws. And several incidents in the years surrounding the Grush testimony, including a small number of claimed physical evidence cases that were later exposed as fabrications or exaggerations by researchers within the field itself, have already demonstrated the reputational risk this dynamic poses. A field working to establish credibility is only as strong as its weakest, widely publicized claim, and the hybrid phenomenon specifically, given its inherently more sensational and more personally identity-laden character compared to the comparatively more sober craft and propulsion question, is particularly vulnerable to exactly this kind of reputational contamination from bad actors operating within the same broad research community. This is, in the end, the honest state of the field as this investigation approaches its conclusion, a phenomenon with 65 years of accumulated, internally consistent testimony, a body of physical evidence that is genuinely unusual by conventional scientific standards without ever crossing into definitive proof. A whistleblower and institutional trail that has, in just the last several years, moved from complete governmental denial to sworn congressional testimony and formal Pentagon acknowledgement of the broader phenomenon this claim exists within, and a scientific case against its literal truth that is serious, well-grounded, and largely unanswered, while not being quite as categorically decisive as it would be applied to a claim of natural, unassisted interspecies reproduction rather than technologically mediated genetic engineering by a civilization whose mere presence, if real, already implies capability well beyond current human science. None of this adds up to proof. All of it, taken together, adds up to a phenomenon that has earned more serious, sustained attention than the dismissive treatment it received for most of its documented history, and less certainty than either its most committed proponents or its most reflexive skeptics are typically willing to admit. With this assessment established, the investigation now turns, in its remaining parts, to drawing together the full arc of everything examined so far, returning to the individual human stories that anchored this investigation from its opening moments, and closing with a final, honest reckoning of what this phenomenon asks of anyone willing to take it seriously without either surrendering critical judgment or dismissing testimony that, whatever its ultimate source, has proven remarkably resistant to easy explanation for over 6.5 decades. It's worth, at this point in the investigation, returning to where this all began. Not to the theories, the whistleblowers, or the government reports, but to the individual people whose testimony gave this phenomenon its shape in the first place, and asking what has actually changed for them across the 6.5 decades this investigation has covered, and what, if anything, that tells us about the phenomenon's ultimate nature. Betty and Barney Hill never received the confirmation they spent the rest of their lives, in Barney's case, a shortened life, hoping for. No government report ever validated their star map. No physical evidence ever definitively proved the medical procedures Betty described under hypnosis. What they received instead was something closer to a strange, partial cultural absorption. Their case became foundational to an entire field of study, referenced in academic papers, dramatized in television movies, cited by every subsequent researcher examined throughout this investigation. And yet the core question they lived and died without answering, what actually happened to them on that dark New Hampshire highway in 1961, remains to this day precisely as unresolved as it was the morning after. This is worth sitting with as a sobering baseline for everything that follows. 65 years of accumulated testimony, physical evidence, whistleblower disclosure, and institutional acknowledgement of the broader phenomenon have not resolved the single case most responsible for starting the entire field. If anything, the passage of time has only added complexity, more competing theories, and more speculative frameworks layered on top of an original account that remains, at its core, exactly as ambiguous as it was in 1964. Sarah, whose 15-year documented case occupied significant attention in the middle portion of this investigation, offers a similarly instructive, if more contemporary, endpoint. She has, according to the most recent published updates from her investigating clinician, continued to report contact experiences into the present day, continued to describe an evolving relationship with the hybrid daughter she has followed across decades of intermittent encounters, and continued to live what her clinician describes as, in every other respect, an entirely ordinary, functional adult life, employed, socially connected, psychologically stable by every standard clinical measure, aside from the specific content of her reported experiences. She has never sought public attention for her case, has participated in research documentation specifically to contribute to the broader scientific understanding of this phenomenon rather than for any personal gain, and has, by her own repeated statements across years of interviews, made a version of peace with an experience she does not expect to ever fully understand or resolve. If there is a representative endpoint for what a genuine, sincerely held hybrid experiencer's life actually looks like after decades of contact, stripped of the sensationalism that surrounds the field's more public-facing figures, it looks considerably more like Sarah's quiet, unresolved, ongoing accommodation than like the dramatic confrontation or revelation that popular treatments of this subject often imagine. This pattern, quiet endurance rather than dramatic resolution, recurs across nearly every well-documented case this investigation has examined, and it's a detail that deserves more weight than it typically receives in popular treatments of this phenomenon. David Jacobs and John Mack, the two researchers most responsible for transforming scattered testimony into a documented body of case files, both continued their work until the ends of their respective careers, without ever reaching the kind of definitive conclusion that would have resolved the question either way. Mack died in 2004, struck by a car in London, having spent the final decade of his career defending, refining, and continuing to investigate a body of testimony that never crossed into the kind of hard proof his critics demanded and that he himself, by his own repeated statements, would have welcomed as much as anyone. Jacobs continued publishing and refining his hybrid integration theory into the 2010s, watching his own conclusions grow more speculative and correspondingly more contested even among researchers otherwise sympathetic to his earlier work, a trajectory that illustrates something important about this field generally. The deeper any individual researcher goes into this material, the harder it becomes to maintain the careful, provisional rigor that made their earliest work credible, a tension this investigation itself has had to actively guard against throughout, particularly in the more speculative middle sections addressing integration theory and present-day hybrid identification. What, then, does the totality of this evidence actually support, when weighed as honestly as 65 years of accumulated material allows? It supports, at minimum, the conclusion that something genuinely unresolved is occurring within a significant population of people who report these experiences, not necessarily literal alien contact, but a real, consistent, cross-culturally recurring phenomenon that current psychological and physiological science has not yet adequately explained through any single existing framework, whether sleep paralysis, cultural contamination, attachment trauma, or deliberate fabrication. Each of those conventional explanations accounts for a genuine portion of the overall testimony. None of them, examined honestly against the strongest cases this investigation has reviewed, accounts for the whole of it. It supports, with somewhat more circumstantial but still real evidentiary weight, the conclusion that governments have studied and continue to study some dimension of a broader non-human phenomenon at a level of classification that has only recently begun to yield institutional acknowledgement, and that a smaller, less confirmed thread of that classified interest may extend specifically into the biological and genetic territory this investigation has centered on, based primarily on the secondhand but legally sworn testimony of David Grush, and the structural plausibility that testimony carries given everything else this investigation has established about historical government secrecy on this broader subject. It does not support, and this investigation has tried throughout to avoid overstating, a confirmed, scientifically validated conclusion that human alien hybrids exist and walk among us today. That claim remains, after everything examined across 15 parts of this investigation, exactly where it has stood for decades, a sincerely held belief among a substantial population of experiencers and researchers, supported by testimony too consistent and too emotionally specific to dismiss reflexively, corroborated by physical evidence too ambiguous to serve as proof, and situated within a broader institutional context that has, in just the last several years, moved dramatically toward legitimizing the wider phenomenon this specific claim has always depended on for its plausibility. This is, ultimately, the space this investigation has to leave its audience in, not the tidy confirmation a documentary title like this one might promise, and not the reflexive dismissal a purely skeptical treatment would offer, but the genuinely unresolved middle ground that 65 years of the best available evidence actually supports. In the final parts that remain, this investigation turns to what that unresolved middle ground actually asks of the people living within it. The experiencers who carry this testimony forward, the researchers who have staked careers on taking it seriously, and the broader public now watching a phenomenon it dismissed for decades slowly, unevenly, and incompletely move toward the kind of institutional legitimacy that might eventually either resolve this question definitively or reveal it to be something else entirely, stranger or more mundane than anyone currently involved has yet imagined. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty this phenomenon demands of anyone who spends real time with it, and it's worth naming directly as this investigation moves toward its close: the demand to hold two things simultaneously that most people, understandably, prefer to resolve into one. The demand to take seriously a body of testimony too consistent, too physically corroborated in places, and too institutionally entangled with genuine government secrecy to dismiss as pure fantasy, while also refusing to grant it the certainty its most committed proponents sometimes claim for it. Most people, when they encounter a subject like this, want to know which side they're supposed to be on. This investigation has tried, across everything examined so far, to demonstrate why that framing itself may be the wrong one for this particular phenomenon, and why the researchers who have spent the most credible, careful decades in this field, Jacobs and Mack chief among them, but also the physicians who examined implant cases, the psychologists who documented multi-generational family patterns, and the military officials who have only recently found the institutional courage to speak under oath, have almost universally arrived at exactly the same uncomfortable middle position rather than a clean resolution in either direction. It's worth considering, too, what this phenomenon might look like from a vantage point further in the future, whether that future confirms, refutes, or simply continues to leave this question unresolved. If some version of the hybridization hypothesis is eventually confirmed through the kind of rigorous genetic evidence discussed in the previous parts of this investigation, historians of science will likely look back on this exact period, the years surrounding Grush's testimony, the Pentagon's institutional acknowledgement of the broader phenomenon, the first tentative purpose-built genetic studies of self-identified hybrid populations, as the hinge point where a phenomenon spent 6.5 decades in the evidentiary wilderness before finally accumulating the specific, reproducible evidence needed to cross into confirmed scientific fact. Every genuinely transformative scientific discovery in history, from continental drift to the germ theory of disease, spent a period of exactly this character, dismissed by mainstream institutions, kept alive by a comparatively small number of researchers willing to accept professional risk in pursuit of an unpopular but carefully evidenced conclusion before eventually accumulating enough corroborating evidence to force a genuine paradigm shift. This does not mean the hybrid hypothesis will follow the same trajectory. It means the trajectory is not without precedent, and it means the dismissive framing this subject has received for most of its history is not, on its own, evidence against its ultimate truth, any more than institutional dismissal was evidence against continental drift for the several decades mainstream geology spent rejecting it. Alternatively, and this possibility deserves exactly the same weight, rather than being treated as the more respectable default conclusion, it is entirely possible that further investigation over the coming years and decades will gradually explain away the hybrid phenomenon through some combination of the conventional frameworks this investigation has examined throughout. A better understanding of trauma-related memory formation, a more complete mapping of previously unrecognized physiological and neurological conditions that could account for the reported symptoms, and a clearer picture of how cultural narratives propagate and shape individual memory and self-identification, even in the absence of any external, non-human stimulus. This would not make the testimony examined throughout this investigation worthless, or the researchers who documented it foolish. It would mean that a genuine, real human phenomenon, one involving real distress, real physiological anomalies, and real family patterns, had a terrestrial, psychological, and cultural explanation all along, one that took decades of careful research to properly identify and characterize, exactly as many genuine medical and psychological conditions took decades of dismissal and misunderstanding before science developed the tools to explain them accurately. Multiple sclerosis, for instance, was for a period in medical history attributed to psychological hysteria before neurological imaging technology developed the capability to reveal its actual physical basis. The history of medicine and psychology is not short of examples where a real, consistently reported phenomenon eventually received a correct explanation only after conventional science initially reached for the wrong one. What both of these possible futures share, and what this investigation considers its most defensible conclusion after everything examined across 16 parts, is that the testimony itself, the consistency, the emotional specificity, the cross-generational patterns, the physiological anomalies, and the small but genuine body of physical and institutional evidence deserves to be taken seriously as data, regardless of which explanatory framework eventually proves correct. Dismissing it reflexively, as much of mainstream science and media did for most of the 20th century, forecloses the possibility of ever properly investigating and understanding it, whatever its true nature turns out to be. Accepting it uncritically, as some of the field's more enthusiastic proponents have at times been inclined to do, risks the same intellectual failure in the opposite direction, granting certainty to a body of evidence that, as this investigation has demonstrated repeatedly, does not yet support it. The position this investigation has tried to model throughout, careful attention, genuine weight given to credible testimony and evidence, honest acknowledgement of scientific objections and evidentiary limitations, and a comfort with sustained uncertainty rather than premature resolution, is admittedly a harder position to hold than either confident belief or confident dismissal. It is, this investigation would argue, the only position the actual evidence currently supports. There is one more dimension worth addressing before this investigation closes, because it has been implicit throughout but deserves to be stated directly. The question of why this phenomenon, more than almost any other unresolved question in contemporary science and culture, generates the particular intensity of public fascination it does. Part of the answer is obvious and requires little elaboration. The prospect of contact with non-human intelligence touches something close to the deepest human curiosity about our place in the universe, a curiosity that predates modern science by millennia and shows up across nearly every human culture and religious tradition in one form or another. But the hybrid dimension specifically taps something even more particular than generic curiosity about alien contact. It touches the question of lineage, of what we pass to our children and what what might, without our knowledge or consent, already have been passed to us. It asks whether the boundary between self and other, human and non-human, is as stable and as clearly defined as most people spend their lives assuming it to be. That is a more intimate, more unsettling question than whether intelligent life exists somewhere else in the universe, and it may be the reason this specific corner of the broader UFO phenomenon has generated a depth of personal, emotional investment among experiencers and researchers alike that the more abstract craft and propulsion question, however scientifically significant in its own right, has never quite matched. With that, this investigation arrives at its final part, not to offer the resolution that 65 years of accumulated evidence has never provided, but to draw together one last time what a careful, honest examination of this phenomenon actually leaves us with, and what it asks of anyone willing to keep watching this space as it continues, unevenly and incompletely, to unfold in the years ahead. 65 years after a couple driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire lost 2 hours they could never account for, the question this investigation set out to examine remains formally unresolved. No government has confirmed the existence of a human-alien hybridization program. No laboratory has produced a verified sample of non-terrestrial genetic material. No hybrid individual has ever been definitively identified, examined, and confirmed under conditions that would satisfy a scientific journal, a courtroom, or even a moderately skeptical newsroom by the strictest possible standard of proof, the standard this investigation has tried to apply consistently throughout. The central claim in its title remains unproven. That sentence is worth stating plainly, without hedging, because an investigation that spent 16 parts building a careful, evidence-based case owes its audience the same rigor in its conclusion that it demanded of every individual claim along the way. And yet, unproven is not the same as empty, and it would be equally dishonest to close this investigation by suggesting that nothing of substance has been established. What has been established, across everything examined in this account, is a body of testimony spanning 65 years, thousands of individuals, dozens of countries, and remarkably little direct contact between the people providing it, converging on a specific, detailed, emotionally consistent narrative structure that no single conventional explanation, not sleep paralysis, not cultural contamination, not attachment trauma, not deliberate fabrication, fully accounts for on its own. What has been established is a small but genuine record of physical evidence, scars appearing in consistent, documented locations before the subjects consciously recalled the events that produced them. Implanted objects surgically removed under standard medical conditions and found by credentialed and disinterested laboratories to display characteristics those laboratories could not fully explain through known manufacturing processes. Radiation and physiological anomalies measured by instruments rather than recalled from memory. What has been established is a documented history of government secrecy and misdirection around the broader phenomenon this testimony exists within, admitted in some cases decades after the fact, and a very recent, very real shift toward institutional acknowledgement of that broader phenomenon, anchored by sworn congressional testimony from a credentialed former intelligence officer operating through a legal whistleblower framework specifically designed to screen out baseless claims. None of this, added together, constitutes proof. All of it, added together, constitutes something this investigation would argue deserves to be called evidence. Incomplete, contested, resistant to easy synthesis, but evidence nonetheless of the kind that responsible inquiry does not get to simply set aside because it fails to arrive in the clean, singular form a courtroom or a peer-reviewed journal would prefer. Science has, at various points in its history, been forced to sit with exactly this kind of uncomfortable, partial evidentiary picture before eventually resolving it one way or another, sometimes toward confirmation of an idea long dismissed as fringe, sometimes toward a more mundane explanation that took decades of careful work to properly identify. This phenomenon has not yet reached that resolution. Based on everything this investigation has examined, it is genuinely impossible to say with confidence which direction it will ultimately break, or whether it will resolve cleanly at all, rather than settling, as many contested questions do, into a permanently ambiguous, partially explained middle ground. What can be said with confidence is this: the people whose testimony built this field, Betty and Barney Hill driving home through the dark in 1961, Antonio Villas Boas carrying an unchanging account to his grave in 1991, the hundreds of subjects who sat across from David Jacobs and John Mack through the 1980s and 90s, describing nursery rooms and infants they could not rationally explain feeling love for. Sarah, still living today with an ongoing relationship she has spent 15 documented years trying to understand. David Grush, placing his career and his legal standing behind sworn testimony delivered under federal oath. None of these people, examined individually and collectively across everything this investigation has covered, present as people with an obvious motive to lie, a documented history of fabrication, or a psychological profile that adequately explains away the specific, consistent content of what they described. That does not make them correct. It makes them witnesses whose testimony has earned more careful attention than dismissal and less certainty than belief, and it leaves this investigation and anyone who has followed it through to this final part in the same unresolved position the evidence has occupied for 65 years, unable to confirm, unable to dismiss, and unable, if genuinely honest about everything examined here, to walk away entirely convinced the question is closed. Perhaps that is the only honest place a genuine investigation into this subject can end, not with the tidy revelation a documentary title promises, and not with the comfortable dismissal that lets an audience close this out and move on without any lingering unease. Somewhere between those two poles is where the actual evidence sits, where it has sat for 6.5 decades, and where, based on everything currently underway in genetic science, government disclosure, and ongoing field research, it is likely to remain for some time yet. Whether that changes in the coming years through a confirmed genetic study, a more detailed whistleblower disclosure, or some form of evidence no one currently involved in this field has yet anticipated, is not something this investigation can predict. What it can say, with confidence earned across everything examined in the parts that came before this one, is that the question itself has outlived every attempt to laugh it away, and that the people asking it, from a New Hampshire highway in 1961 to a congressional hearing room in 2023, have not stopped asking it because the evidence told them to stop. They stopped only when they ran out of time and handed the question, unresolved, to whoever would take it up next. That is where this account leaves it. Not answered, not dismissed, still open, still being asked by people with no obvious reason to keep asking it except that something happened to them they have never been able to fully explain and never been able to fully forget. There is a photograph reproduced in nearly every book written about the Hill case of Betty and Barney sitting together in their living room sometime in the mid-1960s, not long after their sessions with Dr. Simon concluded. They are not smiling for the camera in any performed way. They look like two people who have already had the hardest conversation of their lives and are simply waiting to see what happens next. That photograph, more than any star map or hypnotic transcript, is where this investigation would like to leave its audience, because it captures something the preceding 17 parts have tried to hold on to throughout. This was never, for the people at the center of it, an abstract puzzle. It was a life they had to keep living, long after the cameras and the researchers and the skeptics had said their piece and moved on to the next case. 65 years is a long time for a question to remain this alive. Most claims of this magnitude either collapse under scrutiny within a decade or two, or they accumulate enough hard evidence to settle the matter definitively, one way or the other. This one has done neither. It has instead done something rarer and, in its own way, more interesting. It has survived. It has survived professional ridicule, survived the retirement and death of nearly every researcher who built its early foundation, survived decades in which mainstream science would not touch it, and mainstream media would not cover it without a punchline attached. And it has survived into an era that, against most predictions made even 10 years ago, has finally begun taking its parent phenomenon seriously at the highest levels of government and defense. whatever else can be said about this subject, it has proven considerably more durable than the dismissal it was handed for most of its existence. This investigation has not tried to settle the question its own title poses, because the honest answer is that the question is not yet settled, and any documentary claiming otherwise would be selling certainty it does not actually possess. What it has tried to do instead is something this field has often lacked: a full, patient accounting of what is actually known, what is credibly alleged, what remains purely speculative, and where the boundaries between those three categories genuinely sit. That accounting does not end in triumph. It ends, as most honest investigations into deeply contested territory eventually do, in a kind of respectful uncertainty, a refusal to pretend the evidence says more than it does, paired with an equal refusal to pretend it says nothing at all. If there is a single thread worth carrying forward from everything examined here, it may be this: the people who have lived closest to this phenomenon, the ones with the least distance and the most at stake, have almost never described it in the language of triumph or horror that popular culture tends to reach for. They describe it in the language of complexity, grief braided with love, fear braided with belonging, a private, unresolved relationship with something they did not choose and cannot walk away from, carried quietly across decades while the rest of the world debated whether their experience was even real. That is not the register of a fabricated story built for attention. Attention-seeking narratives tend to resolve cleanly, one way or another, because clean resolution is more satisfying to tell and more satisfying to hear. The testimony at the center of this investigation has never resolved cleanly, not once, across 65 years and thousands of independent accounts. That may be its most persuasive quality, and it may also be exactly why it has never fully broken through into either total acceptance or total dismissal. Ambiguity does not sell as easily as certainty. It has simply had the advantage, in this case, of being true to what people actually describe experiencing. Where this leaves the broader question is roughly where the evidence has always left it, and roughly where this investigation has tried to leave it at every stage along the way: open. Not open in the sense of anything goes, and not open in the sense that belief and skepticism carry equal evidentiary weight regardless of the specifics of any given case. Open in the narrower, more disciplined sense that a genuine question remains genuinely unanswered, that credible people on both sides of it have real evidence and real reasoning behind their positions, and that the honest response to that state of affairs is continued, careful attention rather than a premature verdict in either direction. Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting with an experience they cannot explain, a mark on their skin they cannot account for, or a memory they only partially trust, wondering whether anyone would believe them if they said it out loud. That has been true for 65 years, and based on everything examined across this investigation, it will likely remain true for some time yet, regardless of what governments eventually declassify or what geneticists eventually discover. The evidence may one day resolve this question definitively, toward confirmation or toward a mundane explanation careful research finally uncovers. Until it does, the honest position is the one this account has tried to model from its opening lines to this closing one. Take the testimony seriously, weigh the evidence carefully, resist the pull toward easy answers in either direction, and accept that some of the most important questions a species can ask about itself do not arrive with tidy endings. They arrive, instead, exactly like this one has, quietly, persistently, and unresolved, waiting for whoever comes next to keep asking. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.